Jakarta atau STT Jakarta, dan kita akan segera mulai kegiatan kuliah umum tamu pada sore hari ini, karena di tengah kita telah hadir Profesor Michael Licona from University. Welcome you at the seminary. Dan sebelum kita mulai, ada kata sambutan dari Ikatan Sarjana Biblika Indonesia, karena kegiatan ini terselenggara kerjasama antara Sekolah Tinggi Filsafat Teologi Jakarta, Ikatan Sarjana Biblika Indonesia, dan Sola Scriptura. Untuk itu kami mengundang Romo Titus untuk menyampaikan kata sambutan.
Terima kasih atas kesempatan ini. Salam sejahtera untuk saudara-saudari semua, terutama Bapak Profesor Michael Licona dan kita dari Ikatan Sarjana Biblika atas nama Ibu Pendeta Ira yang tidak bisa hadir di tempat ini bersama-sama. Saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih atas kesempatan yang ditawarkan oleh Sekolah Tinggi Filsafat Teologi Jakarta dan Sola Scriptura untuk mengadakan acara ini. Sungguh sulit sekali mendapat kesempatan yang begitu berharga seperti ini, mengundang profesor yang ternama untuk membicarakan hal yang memang berkaitan dengan topik yang dekat dengan perayaan yang sebentar lagi kita rayakan, perayaan Paskah. Jadi sekali lagi saya merasa bahwa satu kehormatan besar bagi kami Ikatan Sarjana Biblika Indonesia untuk ikut berpartisipasi bersama Anda sekalian untuk menyambut kuliah terbuka dari Profesor Licona. Saya tidak ingin berpanjang-panjang. Saya mengucapkan selamat menikmati seminar ini, konferensi ini, dan semoga kerjasama ini membantu kita untuk semakin memuliakan Tuhan dalam pelayanan kita masing-masing.
Saya hanya mau memberitahu tentang kegiatan kita sampai malam nanti. Kegiatan ini akan dipandu oleh Pendeta Asigor Sitanggang yang merupakan dosen pengajar Biblika Perjanjian Baru di STFT Jakarta, dan nanti akan dibagi dalam 2 sesi. Detail akan diberitahu oleh moderator, dan kita akan ada makan malam bersama di tempat ini, sudah tersedia dan akan dipandu oleh para petugas. Saya kira itu saja. Saya akan mengundang moderator untuk kegiatan ini, Pendeta Asigor Sitanggang, untuk memandu kuliah ini. Selamat mengikuti kuliah.
Baik, selamat sore untuk Bapak yang terkasih dan rekan-rekan mahasiswa sekalian. Sebelum saya mengundang Profesor Licona untuk masuk ke depan, saya ingin menyampaikan satu pengumuman penting terlebih dahulu. Tadi ada seorang ibu yang bertanya kepada saya, apakah seminar ini diterjemahkan dalam bahasa Indonesia? Jadi secara umum sekali saya sampaikan, mohon maaf, dalam brosur yang disebarluaskan juga tidak dicantumkan bahwa akan diterjemahkan. Kami mengasumsikan dengan demikian Bapak yang dalam tanda kutip nekat datang kemari, berarti sedikit banyak menguasai bahasa Inggris. Ini dari tahun lalu juga kami biasakan begitu, kecuali tahun lalu ada 2 profesor dari Jerman datang. Nah itu baru saya terjemahkan ke bahasa Indonesia, karena mustahil berasumsi Bapak mengerti bahasa Jerman semua kan. Nah kalau bahasa Inggris saya rasa bisa diasumsikan seperti itu. Jikalau ada yang tidak mengerti boleh tanya kiri kanan, tapi jangan berisik. Kalau bisa telepati lebih baik lagi. Dan untuk mahasiswa S1 mata kuliah saya Inggris Teologi kelas A dan B wajib membuat report. Exegesis PB juga wajib membuat report. Ada 3 mata kuliah yang saya wajibkan hadir di sini, web exegesis PB dan Inggris Teologi A dan B. Saya mewajibkan membuat laporan. Minggu depan sudah harus masuk 1 hari sebelum perkuliahan saya dimulai. Begitu ya. Oke, hari ini sore ini kita terlambat setengah jam. Mohon maaf atas keterlambatannya, karena ada satu dan lain hal keadaan terlambat, dan kita tetap akan mengikuti sesuai sesuai dengan schedule kita, yaitu dari jam 4 sampai 17.45 kita akan sesi pertama, di mana sesi pertama itu adalah What do we mean by the third historical reliability? Dan kita akan break 17.45 sampai 18.30 berhubung disediakan makan malam. Maka tidak mungkin breaknya di bawah 30 menit, jadi kita sediakan 45 menit untuk makan malam. Tapi kita akan usahakan on time 18.30 mulai dengan sesi kedua dengan judul 6 Criteria for Historical Reliability, Authorship, Bias Contradictions, Dating, Eyewitness Testimony, Fidelity of the Text, God, for example, Miracles, ABCD, EFG. Tema yang kedua dari sesi kedua kita. Dan karenanya kami meminta kooperasi kerjasama dari Bapak sekalian untuk menyimak dengan baik. Jangan bercakap-cakap. Handphone tolong dimatikan, kalau tidak paling tidak silent mode. Dan mahasiswa jangan tidur. Jangan tidur ya, ini bukan sleeping room. Oke, kita tidak akan berpanjang-panjang lagi. So we invite Professor Dr. Michael Licona to go to the front and give applause for him. So let us start for the first session by Professor Dr. Michael Licona. As our friend Eric von Martin has introduced, he's from Houston Baptist University. If you ask whether he's from Baptist or Baptist Church, I don't know. Maybe you should explain. But I said before to my friend, being a lecturer in Baptist University doesn't mean that you're a Baptist. Yeah, so maybe you can introduce yourself first.
Well, thank you, everyone, and it's wonderful to be here with you all. First of all, I want to apologize for being late. It was not Yosafat's fault, it was the traffic's fault. And it was a little more traffic than we expected, and Yosafat said that the reason there's so much traffic is they have come to hear you. And I said, I don't think so. But we got caught in traffic, and please forgive us for being late. I know it's not fun, and it seems like disrespectful, so we apologize. So I'm 56 years old, and I became a Christian at the age of 10, and yes, I teach at Baptist University. I consider myself a Christian. I'm of the Protestant tradition. I was brought up as a Presbyterian. And then went to a Baptist university and joined Baptist churches, and we've gone back and forth from Baptist and Presbyterian, non-denominational. Right now I'm a member of a Presbyterian church. But I'm not a Calvinist. Figure that, you know. But my church is fine with that, and some people in the United States, you know, Calvinist, or you're not a Calvinist, and the non-Calvinists hate the Calvinist, and the Calvinists hate the non-Calvinist. It's like, why? We're all Christians. We're all brothers and sisters in Christ. Why fight over this? And at Houston Baptist University, where I teach, we have Presbyterians and Baptists and Calvinists and Arminians and people who believe the Bible's inerrant like myself. People who do not believe the Bible's inerrant, but we all believe the Bible is God's Word. We all believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and we all get along. And probably 1/3 of the students who go to our school are not Christians. We have one of the top 3 nursing schools in the United States at Houston Baptist University, so we have students come through our nursing school from all over the world. I teach an introduction to Christianity course in the fall, and I usually have Muslims and atheists and Buddhists as students. It's pretty neat. So I get to tell them about Jesus, and it's wonderful. So I became a Christian at the age of 10, and I went to a Christian university. I was a music major. I played saxophone. I was planning on being a professional musician. As I was going through college, I developed a real love to study the Bible, and I was praying a lot, and so I decided to study Greek in graduate school so that I could read the New Testament in its original language. And I was really enjoying that. But then one day I asked myself, is this stuff true? Is the Bible true? And how do I know that it's true? And I started having a lot of doubts about my Christian faith. Because I thought if I'd been brought up in Afghanistan, I'd probably be a Muslim. If I'd been brought up in China, I'd probably be an atheist. If I'd been brought up in India, I'd probably be a Hindu. Maybe the reason I'm a Christian is because that's the way I was brought up. Now, of course, it doesn't matter. I could be brought up, and that's why I believe something, and it still be true. But how would I know? And so this started to bother me because I was thinking, if Christianity is not true, and if God requires that I believe the right religion, then I'm in trouble when I die. So how would I discover truth? So I started to look at the evidence for Christianity and some of the other major world views of atheism. For Christianity, the major question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Because while Jesus was on earth, he made some really radical claims. And his critics asked, well, show us some evidence, show us some signs. And Jesus said, well, I'll give you one major sign, and that's my resurrection. So if Jesus did not rise from the dead, that means he was a false prophet. Why should I be a Christian? But if he did rise from the dead, then it seems that he confirmed his claims about himself. And so I studied the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I was not a real good student in high school and in college. I was okay. But when I got to graduate school, I was a much better student because I was studying. I really wanted to know truth. And I ended up doing a Ph.D., and my Ph.D. work was trying to see if Jesus really rose from the dead. Now, when I was in graduate school writing a 20-page paper, research paper, double-spaced, and a few footnotes, that was really hard for me. But my doctoral dissertation was like 700 and some pages with over 2,000 footnotes. That's how committed I was to doing hard research to find the truth. And I intentionally debated some of the leading atheists and agnostics in North America because I wanted to put the evidence out there to see what they would say in return. Because I figured if the evidence for Christianity was that good, it should be able to withstand critical scrutiny. And so I've been involved in 29 public debates now. And the more I've done it, the more convinced I become of something like Jesus' resurrection, because the evidence is that good. So that's a little of my background. One more thing that led me into these topics I'll be speaking on this evening is when I got in debates with perhaps the leading skeptical New Testament scholar in North America. His name is Bart Ehrman. And as I was involved in a few different public debates with him on the resurrection of Jesus, he would go after the Gospels and try to show that they are not historically reliable. That there were errors in them, and we didn't know who wrote them, and things like that. And for me, it wasn't so important because once you realize that Jesus rose from the dead, everything else becomes of secondary importance. Even if there were errors in the gospel, I mean, I said to Bart Ehrman once, well, Bart, even if you're right that there are errors and contradictions in the gospels, even if the gospels weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Christianity is still true if Jesus rose from the dead. And he agreed. So if that's the case, why get all bent out of shape if we find an error or contradiction in the Gospels? It just didn't bother me like it would have bothered me before studying the resurrection. For me, it would have been, well, gosh, if there's an error in the Bible and in the Gospels, well, then it couldn't be God's Word, and the whole thing falls apart. But then I realized that Jesus rose from the dead, and Christianity is true, even if there were to be errors in the Gospels. And again, then it just didn't keep me awake at night. But I understood that it did bother a lot of So I started to study. And then I spent 8 years studying about gospel discrepancies. And last year came out with a book on it to answer the question, why are there differences in the Gospels? And the title of the book is, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? So, and that was published with Oxford, and so tried to deal with that. And we'll be talking a little about that in the second session this evening. In the meantime, I just love to study history. I love to study it as a historian. I love to study the Gospels in that sense. And to ask the question, this is my current research project, are the Gospels historically reliable? And so that brings us to our topic for this evening. You want me to just go into it from here? Okay. So let's deal with this topic. Are the Gospels historically reliable? Before we can answer this question, we must first deal with another one. What do we mean by the term historically reliable? How would we define that? Well, does it mean that it's divinely inspired, or infallible, or inerrant, or authoritative? No. Does it mean any of those terms? It's kind of like saying, well, Mike is tall. All right, well that describes Mike. Mike has brown hair. That describes Mike. But I could be tall but not have, someone could be tall and not have brown hair and not be Mike. Someone can have brown hair and not tall and still not be Mike. You know, it's just this particular Mike has brown hair and is tall. So what does it mean when we say something is historically reliable? This is an important question. In the Bible, we have the Psalms. We can believe the Psalms are infallible or divinely inspired, etc. But are the Psalms historically reliable? That's not a trick question. Are the Psalms historically reliable? No. Now that doesn't mean they're unreliable historically. It's just you can't really ask that question about the Psalms because they're not historical literature. So to ask, are the Psalms historically reliable? It doesn't apply to the Psalms. What about Tacitus's Annals of Rome? Now Tacitus is the greatest of all the Roman historians. He wrote at the beginning of the 2nd century, and he's writing these, they're like histories of Rome, the Roman Empire, Roman Republic. Now, he's considered to be the most accurate, so is Tacitus's Annals of Rome historically reliable? Yes. But is it divinely inspired? No. Is it infallible? No. Is it without error? No. So you can have something that's historically reliable, but not divinely inspired. You can have something like the Psalms, or Proverbs, or Revelations, and it's divinely inspired, but not historically reliable. Or you could have something that's both. We're not asking this evening whether the Gospels are divinely inspired. That's a different question. We're not asking if they're without error, or infallible, or authoritative. The question we want to ask this evening is, are they historically reliable? So how are we going to define historically reliable? One thing we have to keep in mind is, however we define historically reliable, we don't want to be biased toward the Gospels because we're Christians. If we're going to be fair about this, we want to develop a definition of historically reliable that applies not only to the Gospels, but to all ancient literature. If we're going to be fair, if we're going to do this with integrity, we want it to apply to all ancient literature. Now, here we have to consider something called genre, which means a literary type, a literary style. Proverbs is the genre of wisdom literature. The Psalms are songs. The Gospels are biographies. The book of Acts is a history of the church in the first 3 decades. The the writings of Paul are letters. Revelation is what's called apocalyptic literature. So, if right now, the majority of scholars, of New Testament scholars, agree that the Gospels belong to the genre of ancient biography. Now, what does that mean? We'll look at that in a moment. But ancient biography, they had some different rules than modern biography is written. They were a little, they could be more flexible in the way things were reported. Let me give you an example of a movie that came out in the United States, I don't know, about 25 years ago. The name was Apollo 13. I remember growing up when I was a child. That's when the US and Russia were in the space wars, and the US was going to the moon, and I was really interested in it. I wanted to be an astronaut when I grew up. And I was watching it, and we landed on the moon in 1969, and then the next year, you had Apollo 13 go up, and there was an explosion in the spacecraft, and all the astronauts almost died. They barely got them home safely. Well, the movie portrayed those historical events. And at one point, the people, the engineers at Houston Control, were trying to figure out how to solve some problems to bring the astronauts home safely. And there's this one scene in the movie where Gene Kranz, who was played by the actor Ed Harris, he makes a statement. He's the head of the Houston Control, and he says, "Failure is not an option." And that became an unforgettable tagline for the movie. Failure is not an option. And that was the title of the book that Gene Kranz wrote after the movie. Well, the thing is, Gene Kranz never uttered that statement in real life. What had happened was when the script writers for the movie were interviewing all the witnesses who were still alive and were telling about what happened, they noticed that these engineers had this attitude and approach towards solving the problem that they didn't consider failure to be an option. And so they crafted that statement and put it on, attributed to Gene Kranz, in order to epitomize the attitude and approach that that team had towards solving the problem. So the question is that statement, failure is not an option in the movie, is that historically reliable? And you could say yes or no. I'm going to say yes. Why? Because what those script writers were doing was taking a story that occurred over a 6-day period and squeezing it down within a 2.5-hour movie. And in order to do so, they had to do some artistic adjustments in order to communicate things that it would take 6 days to communicate, but they wanted to do it in an abbreviated manner. And so, technically speaking, in the most technical sense, he did not say that term, but it gives an accurate picture of what really happened. That kind of flexibility, to say that it's reliable in that sense, is the same kind of way that we look at ancient literature, because that's the kind of stuff ancient historians and biographers did on a regular basis. We may not consider it appropriate for writing contemporary history, but we would consider it appropriate for writing ancient history because they considered it appropriate. It was in their rules of writing good history and biography. So when we ask, is something historically reliable? The minimum requirement is that it is the biography or history is preserving an accurate gist of what happened. It is giving us an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. The essence is there. Or as Christopher Pelling, one of the great scholars in the world, he retired from Oxford about 3 years ago, he said, "It's true enough." It's true enough. I like that. So it may not be precise in its detail, but it is giving us an accurate picture of what occurred. Okay. do then is I want to propose 6 criteria for saying if an ancient biography or history meets these criteria, then we can say that it is historically reliable. Now these criteria aren't something that, this is something all historians agree on. These are 6 criteria that I'm proposing, and I think they just make sense. They're common sense. But if you'd like, I'm open to this. This is my present research, and I would definitely be open to any of you pushing back on this. And as we go along with this, I want you to feel free to raise your hand and ask a question or give me a comment. You can interrupt me while I'm talking like this. In fact, I would prefer that. We can do a question. I'll open it and we'll have a question and answer after I'm done, but I want you to feel free to butt in while I'm talking here, okay? Okay, are you all with me so far?
Yes.
Okay. I'm trying not to talk real fast either because I'm sure that English is your second language and I don't have a second language. So one thing in America is when we hear someone talk with an accent, we know that person knows one more language than we do. All right, 6 criteria. The first one is we have good reasons. Oh, by the way, as we're going through this, you can take some notes, and I'll try not to go too fast, but if you miss some of this, I have some of this lecture on my website, and you can review it. My website, let me give it to you. It's risenjesus.com. risenjesus.com. And I have articles and videos on there that you can see, and one of those is a lecture. This is a lengthy, an expanded version, but I have an abbreviated, a shorter version of this on the website. Okay. So the first one is we have good reasons to believe that the author intended to write accurately. We have good reasons to believe that the author intended to write accurately. Number 2, we have good reasons to believe that the author used good judgment in his use of sources. And I'm using the pronoun here, the masculine pronoun his, because all the ancient authors were males, all right? So we have good reasons to believe that the author used good judgment in his choice of sources. Number 3, we have good reasons to believe that the author used good judgment in his use of those sources. So not only did he use good judgment in choosing the best sources, but also in his use of those sources. He didn't distort those sources, he used them with integrity. Number 4, we have good reasons to believe that the author or the author's sources were capable of reporting accurate history. I'm going to explain all these in depth, so if you missed them right here, that's okay. I'm going to cover each one separately. Number 5, we have the ability to verify numerous things reported by that author. And number 6, no more than a small percentage of what that author reports is false. Now remember, we're talking about historical reliability here. We're not talking about whether the author is inspired by God or whether it's without error. We're asking, is it historically reliable? And we're applying this not only to the Gospels, but also to any ancient literature, historical literature written in that period. All right, let's look at these one at a time. Number 1, the author intended to write an accurate account. How would we know? Because we can't question that ancient author now, can we? It'd be nice if we could get into a time machine and return to the past and say, hey Mark, first gospel probably to have been written, hey Mark, were you really trying to write accurately here? That'd be nice to do that and get an answer from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we can't. So how can we can't get into their head and know what they were thinking. Is there a way for us to judge whether they were attempting to report accurately? And I think that there is. Number one, I mentioned how the Gospels are written by the biographical genre. They were written as ancient biographies. Now, biography, ancient biography, for the most part, it was intended to communicate an accurate story about this person, the main character's life. It was meant to be accurate. Now, that doesn't mean that all the authors wrote accurately. In the third century, there was an author named Philostratus, and he wrote a biography of a man named Apollonius of Tyana, who lived in the 1st century. And historians are unanimous that he was not attempting to write an accurate biography. A lot of it was just invented and fictional. So just because they wrote a biography doesn't mean it's true. But the genre itself, when you were writing biography, you were supposed to write accurately. Plutarch, I don't know if you've watched the movie The Hunger Games, it's not that Plutarch, okay? There was a guy named Plutarch who wrote in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, and he wrote over 60 biographies, of which 50 have survived. In fact, for a lot of people, most of what we know from the ancient world comes from Plutarch. And in Plutarch's biography of Alexander the Great, chapter 1, he says this: I am not writing histories, but lives. Now, until the 5th century, biographies were called lives. They weren't referred to as biographies first until the 5th century. 4th or 5th century, I forgot which one. So he says, I'm writing histories, but lives. Now, the difference between a history and a life, a biography, is that a biography, a life, I'm just going to call it a life from now on, okay? When I say a life, the life of Alexander, that means a biography of Alexander. Or the lives of the Caesars, that means the biographies of the Caesars. The difference between a life and a history is a life focused on a single person, whereas a history focused on a period of time, or a government, or a war, okay? Plutarch says, I am not writing histories, but lives. In the most illustrious deeds, there is not always a revealing of one's virtue or vice. However, a small item, like something the person said, or a small gesture from them, often reveals their character more than battles in which thousands died. Painters of portraits seek to capture a person's personality and inner qualities. So they spend most of their time on a person's face, especially their eyes, while giving very little attention to the remainder of that person's body. In a similar manner, Plutarch says, I am creating literary portraits of the main characters of my lives, devoting most attention to things that reveal their inward character and leaving other items of interest for historians to write about. Right, with that in mind, let's look at why scholars think the Gospels are ancient biographies. I'm going to give you a couple of reasons. 4 major reasons. There are more, there are like 10 reasons, but let me just give you 4. Number 1, the main character of a biography, not an era, an event, or government, like I said. It's focusing on a single person. It doesn't mean that other people aren't involved, but they're focusing on a single person. So the Gospels, who are they focusing on? Jesus. But the book of Acts is a history, because it's not focusing on a single person. You've got, Peter is a main character in it, so is Stephen for a couple of chapters, Paul for about half of the book of Acts. So you've got multiple characters that play a big part. Yes, sir? Oh, good question. So the question is, why was Plutarch writing these lives, right? He was writing these, he had what was called a patron. We're not sure who it is, but we have some ideas. And a patron would pay him, it would support him while he did his research. It'd usually be a wealthy person in the Roman government or something like that. And that person paid Plutarch, and he spent years studying and writing these lives. And he also had some philosophical writings. Good question. So, we know it's a biography. One reason is because the focus is on in the Gospels, focus is on Jesus. Number two, this is an interesting one. The biography, the life usually talks about the person's ancestry and then skips right into the launching of their public life as an adult, whether that's in politics or the military or as a philosopher or religious leader. So if you ever wondered, why is it that the Gospels really don't tell us much about Jesus' childhood? Or has anyone ever asked you that question? Well, the reason is they're ancient biographies. And so it talks about Jesus' ancestry. Like Matthew and Luke has his genealogy. Mark begins by saying, as Isaiah the prophet said, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. And then it goes into talking about John the Baptist fulfilling that prophecy. But listen, what's interesting about that is it's not Jesus who's preparing the way for God. So it gives this prophecy, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. But it's not Jesus preparing the way for God. It's John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. What does that say about Mark, who Mark says Jesus is? Oh, he's God. Right there in his portrait of Jesus. That's how it starts off. And the Gospel of John. And Mark's the first Gospel. And then you have the Gospel of John starting off, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. It's saying Jesus is God. So it's making a portrait of Jesus, a literary portrait of Jesus as God. You have the last Gospel saying that, and you have the first Gospel saying that, right at the very beginning. We'll look at more of that. But it talks about the ancestry. According to Mark and John, Jesus is divine. According to Matthew and Luke, you have that ancestry, the genealogies that talk about his Davidic ancestry, because they're presenting him more as the Messiah. Number three, the main subject character is illuminated through their words and deeds. Remember what Plutarch said. He's painting a portrait. So remember Plutarch said, look, there are many things that a person did, but I'm not including them here. They may have defeated thousands in battle, but I might not mention it in my biography because that doesn't illustrate who this person was, what their virtues were, what their vices were, their weaknesses. He says, no, I want to, in my biography, I want to express who this person was, what their strengths were, what their weaknesses, their character deficiencies, their character strengths. That's what I'm doing through a biography, Plutarch says. And that's what we look at with the Gospels. So if the Gospels are ancient biography, now we ought to read them in view of that and say, who are the Gospels portraying Jesus? Now watch this, because this is where it gets beautifully interesting. I never saw this until a few years ago. Because a lot of times scholars will say, you have this evolving Christology in the Gospels. Mark presents Jesus as the Son of Man. And then Matthew, he's the Messiah. And then Luke, he's the Son of God. And then John, he's God. And you can see Jesus growing from one Gospel to the next. But watch this. Once we realize that the Gospels are ancient biography, it changes the way that we view how they're portraying Jesus. Now, Mark, most scholars, New Testament scholars believe, is the first gospel to have been written. Okay? So let's go to Mark, the first gospel, and see what Mark says. Okay. Is Jesus divine in Mark? Well, remember, we started off by, it says, as Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. And it's not Jesus preparing the way for God, it's John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus in that fulfilled prophecy. So right in the very beginning, it's portraying Jesus as divine. That's chapter 1. And then you come to chapter 2. Jesus forgives the sins of a paralytic and heals him. And the Jewish leaders there say, well, that's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. Yep. Chapter 3. Jesus says that his exorcisms demonstrate he has bound Satan and is plundering his kingdom. Remember, the Jewish leaders were saying, he's casting out Satan. It's Satan casting out Satan. And Jesus responds and says, no. Look, if you want to go into a house that's owned by a very strong person, and you want to steal from him, rob him, you have to first bind that strong man, and then you can go in and steal all his possessions. And what Jesus says, that is what he is doing. The strong man is Satan. And by Jesus casting out demons, it is shown that he has bound Satan and is now plundering his kingdom. What human can bind Satan? Chapter 4. Jesus is asleep in a boat. They're crossing the Sea of Galilee, and a storm comes up, and the boat starts to sink because it gets all this water. And the disciples are panicking. And they go wake Jesus up. And they say, we're perishing. Help us. And Jesus goes and he speaks, and he calms the wind and the waves. Well, according to Psalms 89 and 107 and Ecclesiastes chapter 8, calming the wind is something God does. Chapter 5. Jesus raises someone from the dead. Ecclesiastes chapter 8 says only God can raise someone from the dead. You say, wait a minute, Mike. What about Peter and Paul and Elisha and Elijah? Didn't they raise someone from the dead? Yes. But they always did it by praying to God. They did it in the power of God, appealing to God, asking God to do it. When Jesus raised Lazarus, when he raised Jairus' daughter, when he raised the widow's son, he didn't pray. He didn't call upon God. He did it in his own power. Chapter 6. Jesus walks on water. Something according to Job chapter 9 verse 8 is something only God can do. Chapter 9. Jesus casts out a demon. Remember, he comes down with Peter, James, and John after the transfiguration. And a man comes up and he says, I come to your disciples, and my son, he's demon-possessed. He throws himself into the fire and tries to drown himself. And your disciples can't cast out the demon. And Jesus speaks the word and expels the demon, casts the demon out. Later on, his disciples come to him and they say, why weren't we able to cast out the demon? And Jesus says, this kind of demon only comes out by prayer. Yet Jesus didn't pray, did he? He just spoke the word and it came out. What does that say about who Jesus is? Chapter 12. Jesus says he's not only David's son, but also his Lord, talking about pre-existence. Chapters 12 and 13, Jesus talks about how he stands in a special relationship with God as his son, above all prophets, priests, and kings. So when he said that he was the Son of God, it's not just that he was a special person. He's talking, he's above prophets, he's above priests, he's above kings, he's above the angels in heaven. He's divine. Chapters 12, 13, and 14, he says he's the apocalyptic Son of Man, who will be worshipped and served as only God is. In chapter 14, he claims to be the Son of Man again. When the high priest says to him, tell us, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? And Jesus says, yes, yes. And there's even more to it than that. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And what does the high priest do? He tears his clothes and says, blasphemy. He's deserving of death. Well, why was Jesus guilty of blasphemy? It wasn't blasphemy to claim to be the Messiah. Many Jews of that day were claiming to be the Messiah. Josephus said there were many Jews who were claiming to be the Messiah. It wasn't blasphemy. It wasn't blasphemy to claim to be the Son of God either. Prophets were called sons of God. David and the kings of Israel were called sons of God. Remember Psalm 2 verse 7, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." That was originally a psalm meant for a coronation hymn for a new king. So Israel was called the son of God's son. It wasn't blasphemy. What got Jesus charged with blasphemy is he claimed to be the Son of Man who would be worshipped and served as only God is. Check out Daniel chapter 7. Check out the similitudes of Enoch in 1 Enoch. 1 Enoch is quoted by the letter of Jude. So he was charged with blasphemy because he claimed to be the Son of Man, a divine figure. So you look at this, from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 14, it's portraying Jesus as being divine. He's not merely a human or a prophet. Mark, the earliest gospel, portrays Jesus as being divine, God's uniquely divine Son. That's huge. And it becomes crystal clear as soon as you recognize that the Gospels are ancient biographies. There's no evolving view of Jesus throughout the Gospels. The very earliest Gospel, the first one, Mark, presents Jesus as God just as clearly as the last Gospel, John, does. As long as you understand that it's an ancient biography, then it becomes clear. Are you with me? Okay. This is cool stuff. I just love this stuff. I get to do this for a living. A fourth characteristic, and we'll stop at 4 there, but the fourth one is the length. An ancient biography, a life, was typically 10 to 20,000 words. That way it could fit on a single scroll. The role of an ancient biography, the way it was used typically, was it would be read after dinner as a means of education and or entertainment. People didn't have televisions back then, and after dinner they'd sit around and talk. And biographies, if someone could afford it and there was a scroll, they could read it, and the Gospels were meant, they were written so that they could be read in a single sitting, like maybe 3 hours long. 3 hours, boy, who reads for 3 hours straight? Well, they did. They didn't, like I said, they didn't have DVDs back then. They didn't have televisions. So, I mean, this was fun for them. And then when we look at the length of words, the number of words that is, and these are the number of Greek words, since the Gospels were originally written in Greek, you can see Mark, the shortest Gospel, had 11,300 words, and Luke, the longest Gospel, had 19,000, roughly 19,500 words. So they're all within that range of the length of an ancient biography. These are 4 characteristics of ancient biographies, and you can see how the Gospels meet that. Like I said, there are like 10 characteristics of each. So that's pretty much the reason why scholars today view the Gospels as ancient biographies or a life of Jesus. And so just because it's a life of Jesus, that would mean that it was usually meant to communicate accurate truth about that person. Now, there have been a few scholars in recent years who would say that the Gospels are not biographies, instead they're ancient novels. The problem with that is that when we look at ancient novels, I mean, there are certain things that ancient novels have that the Gospels have. But the same could be said about all ancient biographies. They share some things in common with ancient novels. The same has been said about the book of Acts. Now, Craig Keener was here last year, I think it was, and he's an expert on the book of Acts and has written huge commentaries on the book of Acts. And he shows how the book of Acts is history. It's a history of the church. Well, some scholars have said, no, it's an ancient novel because of all the shipwreck scenes. Well, it is true that novels have shipwreck scenes. But it's also true that histories have shipwreck scenes. So just because they have shipwreck scenes doesn't mean that they're ancient novels. Keener goes on to show that ancient novels were typically romances in which two lovers overcame obstacles. Now that's not the Gospels, is it? Unless you want to go with the Da Vinci Code and believe that Mary Magdalene and Jesus had this thing, right? But no credible scholars believe that. So it's not ancient, it's not a romance. Ancient novels almost always involved fictitious characters of the distant past. Only rarely would ancient novels involve historical characters. But even when they did, that novel, the character, had not lived within even a century of when that novel was written. Well, the Gospels feature historical characters who had lived within the living memory of the authors. Pontius Pilate, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, the Herods, John the Baptist, Caiaphas, Jesus. These are all historical figures, and they have lived within a relatively recent time, just a few decades of when the Gospels were written. So there's no examples, not a single one, of an ancient novel that had historical characters who had lived within just a few decades of that novel. So there are no good reasons to think that the Gospels are ancient novels. So, the author intended to write an accurate account. We're looking at biographical genre. We can also see that the Gospels have a stated historical intent. So the Gospel of Luke, it seemed, he says in chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know for certain the things you have been taught. Luke is saying he is intending to write accurate history. Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 35. And the one who is seeing these things has testified. His testimony is true, and he knows he is telling the truth, so that you may also believe. Whether you believe John or not, he's still saying he's telling the truth. And then you have a suggested historical intent. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. It's things that the person says suggests that they're intending to write accurate history. We get this from the Gospel of Mark, when it talks about Simon of Cyrene, who's carrying Jesus' cross. The Gospel of Mark says, the soldiers forced a passerby to carry his cross, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was coming in from the country. Scholars have looked at this and said, well, why does Mark add the father of Alexander and Rufus? And many of them have said, well, that suggests that the readers of Mark's Gospel knew Alexander and Rufus. And so this is stating Mark is saying, hey, you know these things to be true. I'm just reporting them for you here. Second criterion, that's the first one. We have good reasons to think the author intended to write accurate history. And we can see we have some reasons. Now let me add this. When we're talking about historical investigation, there is no such thing as absolute certainty. In order to have that, we have to get into a time machine and go back to the first century and watch this stuff happen. Of course, we can't do that. So what we are looking for is reasonable certainty. That's all historians can hope for, even with non-religious matters outside of the Bible. So we can see there are good reasons to think that the authors intended to write accurate history. Number two, we have good reasons to think the author shows good judgment in his choice of sources. Now, did the gospel authors have sources? Yes. When we're talking about Mark, Gospel of Mark, the early church tradition says that he was repeating what he had heard from Peter, the lead apostle. Now, by the way, Bart Ehrman and some scholars out there will say, we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. Well, that's just false. You can watch my debates with Bart Ehrman on my website. They're on YouTube. In fact, just 4 weeks ago, what is the day? On March 21st, I debated Bart Ehrman again. And we debated on the historical reliability of the Gospels. You can go watch that on YouTube. Well, I don't think it's on my website yet. It might be. But it's certainly on YouTube. And it's already got, what's it, 18,000, 17,000 views in 3 weeks. And Bart says, we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. Well, that's just false. I did a study a few months ago, and we went to the Emory University Library, which is one of the finest theological libraries in the United States. And I got down every single commentary on the Gospel of Mark from 1965 to the present, and then New Testament introductions that talk about authorship and things like that. And I found about 75 different sources, right around that. And the majority of scholars writing on it say that Mark wrote the Gospel and he got his information from Peter. So people like Ehrman just haven't checked this stuff out. Maybe he's only talking to other skeptical scholars, but when you look at and I'm talking about critical scholars. So there are some New Testament scholars with PhDs in theology or New Testament, and they'll teach and they will be pastors of churches and they write in a devotional sense. When I say critical scholar, I'm talking about scholars who really get down in the dirt and study this stuff. So the majority of critical scholars think that Mark was the author of Mark's Gospel and that he got his information from Peter. So I'd say if you are getting your information from Peter, he was a pretty good source about Jesus, wouldn't you? Doesn't get much better. The Gospel of Luke, the majority of scholars, and now I haven't checked this out, but Craig Keener has when he was doing his research on the book of Acts. And Craig Keener tells me that the majority of critical scholars think that the author of Luke and Acts was a traveling companion of Paul, and that the best candidate for this was Luke, the physician. And scholars believe that Luke's primary sources were Mark, who was based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter, a hypothetical source perhaps that scholars call Q. Now, you're in a seminary here. How many of you know what Q is? Okay, several of you? Q, here's the thing. Sosh? How many have heard of Sosh? Did I say that wrong? Oh, I said it wrong. All right, well, here's the thing. When Matthew, Mark, and Luke report the same thing, often word for word, close to it, then scholars think that Matthew and Luke used Mark as the source. If Matthew and Mark report something almost word for word, Luke reports the same thing, but it's kind of different, then Matthew used Mark as the source, Luke used a different source. If Luke and Mark sound similar, but Matthew's different, then Luke used Mark, and Matthew used a different source. But there are a little over 200 verses, each in Luke and Mark, and Matthew, where Matthew and Luke are very similar, reporting the story, and that story is not in Mark. So they couldn't have used Mark as their source, right? So in that case, either Luke used Matthew, or Matthew used Luke, or Matthew and Luke used a common source that we no longer have today. And the majority of scholars think that third option is what happened. Now there are some very, very good scholars who say Luke used Matthew, or Matthew used Luke, and that's possible. But the majority today, I'm one of them, but I could be wrong, think that Matthew and Luke used a common source that we no longer have, and the word source in German is Quelle. And when you abbreviate that, you just say Q. That's all Q is. It's the hypothetical source that's common to Matthew and Luke. So, but if there was no Q, then that means either Luke used Matthew as a source or Matthew used Luke as a source. Was Q written or oral tradition? We don't know. But those would be the only options. And then Paul would have been one of Luke's sources, and then other eyewitnesses. That's pretty good sources. Gospel of John, who claims to have been a disciple. Now, when it comes to the majority of scholars today, the early church tradition said that the author of John's Gospel was John, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' 12 disciples.
Now, the majority of scholars today don't think that. They don't think that John the son of Zebedee wrote John's Gospel. I'm one of the minority that thinks that he did. Ray Keener thinks that John the son of Zebedee wrote it. Ben Witherington thinks that it was Lazarus. He actually has a pretty interesting report that I would find compelling if some of the early church fathers said that Lazarus wrote it, but none of them did. And I find it difficult to think that Lazarus wrote it, and nobody ever in the early church said that he did. But the majority of scholars today think that whoever wrote John's Gospel was either one of Jesus' minor disciples, not one of the 12, but a minor disciple who traveled with Jesus, or that the author used one of Jesus' disciples as one of their sources. So either way, we've got eyewitness or very close to eyewitness. Every bit as good as at least the Gospel of Mark, if not even better. And finally, the Gospel of Matthew. The authorship of Matthew is the most difficult. And the reason being is because the early church tradition says that Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, wrote it. And it was the most popular gospel in the early church. The problem is the earliest author to say that Matthew wrote it was a guy named Papias in the early 2nd century, perhaps the late 1st century. Papias may well have found one of Jesus' disciples. But he says that Matthew originally wrote in Aramaic or Hebrew. The problem is our Gospel of Matthew is Greek. Another problem is that even conservative evangelical scholars will say Matthew is not written in translation Greek. In other words, the kind of Greek that Matthew writes isn't the kind that makes it sound like he's translated from another language. In fact, he's using Mark a whole lot. About 200 some verses are from Mark as a source, which is in Greek. And then a lot of times these authors, when they're quoting the Old Testament, use the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament. So it wouldn't appear that Papias was correct on that. So if he wasn't correct on that, how do we know he was correct on the authorship of Matthew? But there are different solutions to that. Maybe Papias, he doesn't say that Matthew wrote a gospel. He said, for those of you in seminary here and have taken Greek, that he wrote the logia, the words, the teachings of Jesus in Hebrew or Aramaic. So maybe it was the Q source. Or maybe it was a few of Jesus' sermons. Jesus has 5 lengthy sermons, like the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe it was 2 or 3 of those that were originally in Hebrew or Aramaic, and they got translated into Greek and supplemented with Mark, and that's the Gospel of Matthew that we have today. My suspicion is that whatever happened, maybe it was some of that, but it was all done under the supervision of Matthew. And the reason I think that, I'm open to Papias being wrong, but the reason I think that is when you have the unanimous testimony of the early church saying that Matthew wrote it. They're all wrong. How did they come to that thought that Matthew wrote it if Matthew had nothing to do with the authorship of that gospel? It just seems to me that it's most plausible to think that Matthew played some part in the composition of that gospel. What that part was, whether it was supervision or writing part of it, I don't know. But it seemed that he played a part in it that was significant enough to attribute it to him. And the sources that we know of Matthew would be Mark, Q, and at least one other source. So, regardless of who we regard some of the authors to be, we can see they use good judgment in their choice of sources. Number 3, the author shows good judgment in his use of those sources. Now, let me show you this. Plutarch wrote, I mentioned 50 biographies that have survived. One of those biographies is his life of the Roman general Coriolanus. Now, classicists, those who work with this ancient Greek and Roman literature, have discovered that Plutarch only used one ancient source in the composition. He didn't use multiple sources. How they tell us? Probably because so many verbatim copy. I don't know. But they say that Plutarch's biography of Coriolanus, he used one source, and that was Roman history by Dionysius of Halicarnassus. So, what we can do then is we can compare how Plutarch uses Dionysius and we can see whether he sticks to his source or whether he invents a lot of things or gets some things wrong. Well, guess what? We can do the same thing. Since we know that Matthew and Luke used Mark, we can do something similar. It's a little more difficult with Q because we don't know whether Q actually existed, but we do know that Matthew and Luke used Mark. So by comparing how Matthew and Luke used Mark, we can see what kind of freedom they took and how did they use Mark with integrity. And we can see, look, I've studied gospel differences for 8 years and compared how they used it. And I can tell you that when Matthew and Luke use Mark, they stick closer to their source than any other ancient biographer sticks to their sources, with the possible exception of Spontaneous. That's pretty good. In fact, when you study gospel differences, what you find out, it's not the differences which are so impressive, it's how similar the gospels are. Almost word for word in so many instances. They stayed very close to their source. They treated their sources with integrity. Number 4, the author or their sources were capable of recalling stories accurately. Now, large-scale conjecturing. Of those 50 biographies, there were some of those biographies that were written within about 150 years of the life of Plutarch. Plutarch's biography, or Life of Caesar, of Cicero, Brutus, Antony, Cato the Younger, Sertorius, Lucullus, people like that, Crassus. He's writing within 150 years. And so he doesn't have to conjecture or kind of make up things or fill in the blanks because he has good sources. In fact, when it comes to Theseus, the legendary founder of Athens, and Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, these figures are believed to have lived 800 to 1,000 years prior to Plutarch writing the lives of his figures. And so Plutarch says this. He's talking about those ones like Cicero and all those that were writing within 150 years, and he says, now that I have traversed those periods of time which are accessible to probable reasoning and which afford basis for a history dealing with facts, I might well say that of the earlier periods of which I'm about to write, Theseus and Romulus, what lies beyond is full of marvels and unreality, a land of poets and fabulous to doubt and obscurity. May I therefore succeed in purifying fable, making her submit to reason and take on the semblance of history. What Plutarch is saying there is when I'm dealing with people and writing about people who lived 800 to 1,000 years before, I don't have good sources for that. Only poets and fabulous mention that. I don't have historians who mention these figures. So don't regard these as historically reliable because I don't have good sources that I've dealt with. But what I've tried to do is write a biography of these people and make it sound and read as though they are reliable. But don't really think that they are. But when I'm dealing, he says, when I'm dealing with people who had lived within a relatively recent period, say 150 years, well, now I have really good sources. I have the Roman records, the government records, and people who, maybe their great-grandfather knew these people. And so I have good sources with which to work, and these accounts are historically reliable. Now here's where it gets interesting. Within 140 years, they're reliable because it's got good sources. What about the Gospels? They're written within only 35 to 65 years of the life of Jesus. There's no need for large-scale conjecturing because when the authors are writing, it's within the living memory of eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses were still alive who had seen Jesus that is. But there's more. Memory. People like Bart Ehrman have called into question memory and he said we can't trust memory because memory gets corrupted. Well, that's true. Memory is not perfect. Memory does get corrupted. People remember things falsely. But it's not as bad as he portrays because generally speaking, we have a pretty good memory if not in every detail, we at least remember the gist of what happened. Now, my wife and I love, I was telling, I think Josephat today, or maybe it was Zach yesterday, but I think it was Josephat, but my wife and I love watching movies about World War II. And we just love it. Well, a few years ago, I was in a doctor's office, and after my appointment, I was walking out of the office, going through the waiting room, and there was all these people, and they were waiting to see the doctor. And I noticed one guy who was wearing a blue baseball cap, and there was a B-29 Super Fortress on it, like this one, embroidered on it. And he was an old guy, like in his late 80s, early 90s. And I walked out, thinking, wow, that guy probably flew on one of those B-29s in World War II. And I just walked out, that's so cool. And then my curiosity just got the best of me. And I walked back in the office, and I walked right up to that guy, and I said, sir, did you by any chance fly on a B-29 in World War II? He said, I sure did, son. I said, you must have some fascinating stories. And he said, yeah, we were stationed on an island in the Pacific Theater. And I'll never forget the native women on that island. They had a horrible odor to them. He remembered how those women smelled even 70 years later. And I can remember that back in 2011, I flew to South Korea, and I was asked to train a bunch of the military chaplains. And so one evening, a friend of mine who was a retired lieutenant colonel, he and I walked the streets of Seoul, Korea. And as we're walking through a tourist area, there was this guy, a vendor, and he had this wok, and he was frying some stuff, or stir-frying it. And we thought, man, we're hungry, let's go find out what this guy has. And we walked up to that wok, and we're thinking, man, that doesn't smell good. Oh, what is it? We looked at it, and he was stir-frying some grub worms. Oh, I can still smell those now. But that night, we had both my friend and I had an upset stomach. It's just like, oh, we just couldn't get that smell out of our nose. Well, here I am, I can still smell it 7 years later. This guy can remember World War II and how those native women on that island smelled 70 years later. We remember things. About 20 years ago, or maybe not quite that long, but about 20 years ago, there was a movie called We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson and Sam Elliott. It was about the first time American soldiers engaged with the North Vietnamese Army in Vietnam in November 1965. And as they flew in there for this actual event, there were like 250 Americans who were killed. Right around there, it was like 251, and then another 245 injured. Finally, the Americans won that battle, but it was just really bad stuff. Well, there's a guy named Joe Galloway, and he was the combat reporter, if you remember from that movie. He was the combat reporter that accompanied them and ended up writing a book with Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore that was the basis for the movie. And a couple of years ago, my wife and I were watching a television series named Vietnam in HD. I told you we like military stuff and war and all that, watching it. And in the first episode, Galloway was on there, and they were interviewing him, and at times he teared up, just recalling the events that had happened 35 years before, still impacted by it. And then there was one part where he said some things, and I thought, whoa, that's profound. And I rewound it and transcribed it, and here's what he said. I left that landing zone X-ray battlefield knowing that young Americans had laid down their lives so that I might live. They had sacrificed themselves for me and their buddies. What I was learning was that there are some events that are so overwhelming that you can't simply be a witness. You can't be above it, you can't be neutral, you can't be untouched by it. Simple as that. You see it, you live it, you experience it, and it will be with you all of your days. Now, of course, that's battle. He was remembered at 35 days later. But you can apply this in your own life. If any of you ladies in here have ever been raped, you could say the same thing. It will be with you all of your days. You will never forget that. You experienced it, and there's no way that you'll forget it. In fact, the guy that would rape you, you'll probably remember stuff about him, like what he smelled like, what he looked like. You don't want to, but that is burned into your memory. Eyewitness testimony. Some things are just so big in your life, so impactful. There's no way you can forget it. Well, let me ask you a question. Let's say that you had been there with Jesus, and you had seen him give sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf. You saw him take a paralytic and heal him so he could walk again. You saw him walk on water, raise the dead. You saw him crucified. And then a few days after, you saw him alive and in perfect health. Do you think that being an eyewitness to those events would have left an impact on you as deep and lasting as those 3 days of battle having choked Aula? You bet you would have. So Jesus' deeds would have easily been recalled, even 35, 50 years later. What about Jesus' teachings? Well, you know, Jesus differed from pastors in that pastors have to prepare a new sermon every week, right? But Jesus was an itinerant preacher. He was going to new towns and villages all the time. So he probably had a dozen, maybe 20 sermons, and he preached those sermons over and 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 over. And then he told his disciples, I want you to go out and preach the same thing you've heard me teach so many times. You've heard, if you want to master something, teach it. They may have taken notes with them. They went out in twos so that they could correct one another. And so those disciples went out and they taught the things that they had heard Jesus teach. They taught it over and 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 over. And then they came back and they debriefed with Jesus. And he could correct them. And then he'd say, all right, I'm going to teach you something else. When you're talking to a Jewish audience, you can say this. But when you're talking to a Gentile audience, you can adjust this parable to make more sense to them. And so they watched him teach these same things over and 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 over. And then he's crucified, he dies. And then a few days later, he's raised from the dead. He's with them for another 40 days. And then before he leaves them, he commissions them. And he says, I want you to go out now and make disciples of the world. And so for the next several decades, they go out and they teach the same things over and over, and you get the idea, perhaps thousands of times. It's not as though Jesus' disciples had heard him teach a message one time and then were trying to recall it 35, 40, 50 years later. They heard him teach hundreds of times, and then they repeated these same things thousands of times, and they were able to corroborate with one another and make sure that these things are true. So they were certainly capable of recalling these things. Well, those are the first three criteria. I won't have time for the fourth and fifth. The fourth one is that we can verify a number of things, and we can. People that are mentioned in the Gospels, we know that they existed, like Caiaphas, Herod, Pilate, all these. We know that places that they mentioned, like the Mount of Olives, Nazareth, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, they all existed. We know that the things that they talk about, certain events, we know that some of those events, we can verify that they existed. All these kinds of things. And then the fifth criterion, only a very small percentage of the things are maybe false. Well, I've asked a number of New Testament scholars, I made a list, and there are only maybe a dozen, 15, 20 different items in the Gospels that have a reasonably good chance of being false. That's not to say that they're false, but they may be. Things like when Luke mentions that Jesus was born in the days of Caesar Augustus when Quirinius, the census that was taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Scholars suspect he might be wrong on that. Now that doesn't mean he's wrong. People have answered that, and some of them have given us plausible solutions to that. So Luke may not have been wrong, so the jury is still out on that. But here's the point I'm making. Remember, we're asking historically reliable. That's the question. Not divinely inspired, not inerrant, but historically reliable. And if it's historically reliable, we can still have mistakes. There are only maybe a dozen to 20 different items in the Gospels that have a good chance of being a mistake. But let me say this, as I've looked at it, most of those have very good, reasonable explanations, and that they're not errors. In fact, I think there are maybe only 2, 3, or 4, just a handful of those that are reason they have a chance of being errors. And when you're talking about all the content in the Gospels and only a handful maybe might be errors, it certainly meets that criteria. So in conclusion, we can see that of those 6 criteria that I discussed, the Gospels meet all 6. Does that mean that we can prove everything in them? No. Does it mean they're divinely inspired? Nope. Does it mean they're infallible? Nope. Does it mean they're authoritative? Nope. It does mean they're historically reliable. And anyone who wants to say they're not bears a burden of proof. So I'm going to take some questions now. In our next session, what we will discuss are some of those arguments that scholars give against the Gospels to try to disprove their reliability, and I will deal with those. So let's open up for some questions.
Let's give an applause. Actually, this is already a dinner time. I think we can spare some time to do the Q&A. I will. Okay, if there are questions that you want to ask, maybe 2 or 3 questions, 2 or 3 persons. 2 only. And Christopher. Okay, okay, the first one is Christopher, one of our students here, and the second one is gentleman over there. I don't know your name. Please, Christopher, come to the front. You may ask in English or in Indonesia. Amisha will translate it for you. And I think you can speak English.
I want to ask about the order of the native woman. No, I'm just kidding. You say that the Christology from the Gospels is evolving. The question is, does the evolution still evolving until now, or it's just the last evolution is only on John, Gospel of John, or it is still until now? Matthew, the author explaining Jesus as the Son of Man, and on Mark is Jesus as the Messiah, and on
Mark, Son of Man, Jesus, Messiah, Luke, Son of God.
Yeah,
But I said that that's wrong.
yeah. So my question is that. Our Christology of Jesus is still evolving until now, because he said that on John, he said that Jesus is God himself, right? dikatakan bahwa ada Injil Markus bahwa Yesus adalah anak manusia, lalu pada Injil Matius bahwa Yesus adalah Mesias, lalu pada Injil Yohanes bahwa Yesus adalah anak Allah, Yesus adalah Allah itu sendiri. Dan apakah kristologi itu akan berkembang sampai hari ini? Apakah hanya berhenti sampai di Injil itu? Itu pertanyaan saya.
Maybe last question here. So, we wanted to ask whether there is a development of Christological idea from the Gospel of Mark until John. Whether you believe it or not. And then if it is a Christological development, will it develop furthermore beyond the Gospels? That's the question. Something like that.
I don't think that there is a major evolution of Christology from Mark through Matthew, or Mark through John. The fact is that Paul wrote his letters even before Mark did, the first gospel, and Matthew was crystal clear that Jesus is God in there. Colossians 2:9, that he is the image of the invisible God. Colossians 2:9, for in Christ all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. You've got Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, where toward the end it says that God gave him the name or title that is above every other title, so that at that title every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Well, what will they confess? And he's referring to Isaiah 45, where it's saying to God, Yahweh, and in that chapter, at least 5 times, I think it's like 8 times, Isaiah says that God says, I am God, I'm the only God, there is none other but me, and to me every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. And Paul is applying that verse to Jesus. So Paul is crystal clear that Jesus is God in some sense. And so he's writing before any of the Gospels. His Christology is every bit as high as John's. And then you have Mark, as I mentioned, how Mark, because he's writing biography, he's illustrating who Jesus is through his deeds and through walking on water, raising the dead, binding Satan, forgiving sins, resulting in salvation. All of these are the kinds of things that acts that belong to God. So, and God alone. So Mark is presenting Jesus as God. He's just illuminating who he is through his deeds. And because Matthew and Luke are using Mark as their primary source, they're mentioning most of those same deeds. And so, of course, they're writing biographies or lives of Jesus. So they're presenting Jesus in the same way. So I don't see evolution of Christology. They just present it differently or from different angles. But I think the Christology from Mark to John is, in essence, the same. Now, did it evolve more after? Well, I don't know how you can evolve to a higher being than God in Christology. But it did change some amongst some sects of Christianity. Some broke off, and you had adoptionists, what we call adoptionists. So they said Jesus was a man, and then God adopted him, either at his baptism or transfiguration or resurrection. He said, hey, I like this guy, and I'm going to adopt Jesus as my son. And so they parted that way from Orthodox Christianity, what the apostles had taught. But that was a different Christology. And then there were some others who would, the Docetists, who would say, you know, Jesus had this divine character and human, but he was only divine rather than human. They tried to, whereas the adoptionists emphasized the human element, the Docetists emphasized the divine element to the exclusion of the human. And they too departed from orthodoxy or the apostolic teachings. So yes, the Christology did change, but it changed in a cultish manner, much like the Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses veer off message from the apostolic message in Orthodox Christianity.
Thank you. Jadi teman-teman, menurut Pak Michael Licona tidak ada perkembangan perkembangan Kristologi. Sebetulnya keempat Injil, empat-empatnya memahami Yesus Kristus sebagai Allah, tapi dari berbagai sudut pandang yang beragam. Jikalau itu berkembang atau berubahnya karena self-affected Kristen seperti doketisme yang menekankan aspek keilahian Yesus yang semu, tidak bertubuh fisik, dan juga satu lagi saya sekali lupa tadi apa? Doketisme, yang satunya lagi adopsionis, bahwa Yesus adalah manusia yang diadopsi jadi Allah. Dan itu adalah perkembangan secara kultik, tapi bukan dalam pengajaran dalam arah pengajaran rasuli atau apostolik. Kira-kira begitu ringkasan penjelasannya. The second question, can you come forward, sir? Yes. Yes, you will ask question, right?
Thank you. I want to ask about the Gospel of John, because some say this gospel is the spiritual gospel or theological gospel. Is this the correct way? Can we also the biography or biography deeply? Or you comment on that? Thank you, sir.
So I want to make sure I understand the question. It's about the Gospel of John being biography, and some say it's more of a theological gospel. So is it biography? Is that what the question is? Yeah, that is a good question. And so was yours, of course. But that is a good question. The Gospel of John is certainly different, as you have observed, than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And as you probably are aware, are you faculty here? Okay, as you're probably aware, scholars debate over John. Now, most agree that it is an ancient biography, but in what sense? And biography was a fluid and flexible genre, so even Plutarch, when he wrote, most of them are there to illustrate the character of that person. But when he wrote his biography of Julius Caesar, it reads more like a history, because he's not even talking about Caesar's character in that, his vices and virtues. He's talking more of what was it about Julius Caesar that gained him such popularity with the people. So it's not like everything was locked in and couldn't be changed, right? In terms of what biography was emphasizing. There were exceptions. And John seems to have been an exception in a sense. So as scholars debate over, you have a prominent evangelical scholar, or conservative scholar, N.T. Wright. And he says, the Gospel of John is like my wife. I love her, but I don't understand her. Now this is something that I've been talking with some scholars who have specialized in the Johannine literature, like John, 1 John, 2 John, 4 John, Revelation. And all of them seem to agree that John paraphrases Jesus more than the others. And he will take things like English translations we have. I don't know how it is with Indonesian translations, but in English translations we have literal translations, like the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, King James Version. And they try to be literal, as close to word for word as possible. And then we have, in English, we have dynamic translations, like the New International Version and the New Living Translation. And they're not as interested in word for word. They want to communicate the thought more clearly and have it a little more easily readable than the literal. And then we have paraphrases that aren't at all trying to be faithful to the exact wording. They're trying to be readable, clear, contain the gist of the message. We might say that the Gospel of John is like a really good paraphrase. So it is preserving essentially what happened, but it is not trying to give us so much of a photograph of what occurred as it is a portrait. And I'm thankful for John in that way, because when John reports some of the same events, he brings out some of the deeper meanings. And now I can read about those same events in Matthew, Mark, and Luke with a little more clarity and understanding of them than I could apart from John. So actually, it seems to me that all four Gospels complement one another and help us to understand what's going on here. If I'm looking for more of what I would have seen had I been there, if I'd actually been there and walked with Jesus, Mark and Luke report is more like that. If I want to read a New International Version, then that's like what Matthew reports with history. And if I want to read a paraphrase, that's like Gospel of John. That's how I do things. It's a very difficult matter for which we can only speculate.
Let us give applause to our audiences. Okay, our first session is already done. We have already prepared our dinner there. There will be no question right now. We will just stop. It's already 18 hours. So we will have like 30 minutes pause. And after that, in 18:30, 6:30 p.m. we will start again. So it's not 45-minute dinner, rather it is 30-minute dinner. So please eat your dinner as quickly as possible. But please don't make our room here messy with the cracks and everything. Please eat nicely because the room is supposed to be nice and kept nice. And the second announcement is we will provide each of you attendants with certificate of attendee. Maybe some students need this, maybe some lecturers need this, so it will be given at the end of the second session to avoid that you just leave after dinner. Kami akan menyediakan sertifikat ini bagi setiap peserta yang hadir, tetapi setelah sesi kedua selesai, menghindari Ibu Bapak setelah makan ambil sertifikat terus pulang, begitu ya. Siapa tahu mahasiswa dari STT baik di sini atau di luar membutuhkan ini, atau dosen-dosen membutuhkan ini, karena untuk dosen untuk akreditasi segala macam ini penting, gitu ya. Siapa tahu dibutuhkan. Sudah ditandatangan oleh wakil ketua 1 kami bidang akademik Sekolah Tinggi Filsafat Teologi Jakarta, dan Bapak tinggal menulis nama masing-masing. Tapi namanya sendiri, jangan nama orang lain, karena akan diberikan berdasarkan daftar absensi di depan, baik yang mendaftar via email maupun yang mendaftar upon arrival tadi. Sekian, terima kasih, sampai sesi kedua. Selamat makan malam. Kita akan berdoa makan malam dulu.
Terima kasih untuk Mas Guru. Ibu Bapak sekalian, di meja
tempat duduk masing-masing kita akan segera mulai karena sudah jam 18.33. Yang ngantri teh silakan dipercepat, mohon, agar kita segera mulai. Yang di luar boleh masuk kembali ke dalam. Mahasiswa yang ada di luar boleh masuk ke dalam dan pintu boleh ditutup. Aulia, pintu boleh tolong ditutup. Panggil dulu yang di luar untuk ke dalam, jangan nongkrong di luar lagi. Oke, sebelum kita memulai, saya dimintakan untuk menyampaikan pengumuman. Ada 2 buku yang disediakan oleh panitia. 2 buku disediakan oleh panitia. Yang pertama, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? What We Can Learn from Ancient Biography. Dan yang kedua, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Saya menyebutkan disediakan oleh panitia bukan dalam arti gratis, tapi dalam arti disediakan untuk dijual, gitu ya. I'm playing words right now. Jadi disediakan di luar untuk ibu bapak membelinya, harganya relatif mahal. Yang satu katanya $35, yang satu lagi katanya $45. Tetapi kalau ibu bapak belinya di toko buku umum dan di sono, di kampungnya Donald Trump. Tapi kalau di kampungnya Asigor Sitanggang, harganya tidak sampai Rp200.000, antara 120, 150 dan sekian. Jadi kalau ada yang berminat, silakan. Mungkin menghemat tidak perlu ke Starbucks dulu 1 bulan ke depan demi memiliki 2 buku ini, khususnya mahasiswa. Mungkin bisa begitu supaya buku ini boleh. Kan, oke, sound system sudah nyala. Tenang saja ya Bapak, itu karena gangguan listrik, bukan karena ada hantu-hantu gentayangan ya. Okay, so we will come to the second session. The second session dua kali mati.
Sekali lagi. Jangan apa Pak.
So the second session will be 5 objections against the Gospels. So we will just give the place to Professor Licona. Let us first give applause for him.
Thank you. So we've just covered some reasons to think that the Gospels, 6 major reasons to think that the Gospels are historically reliable accounts of Jesus. What I'd like to do in this session, it's not like scholars, skeptical scholars just roll over and say, oh, that's wonderful, okay, I believe now. They come up with 5 major objections against the historical reliability of the Gospels, and so I want to discuss these with you during this lecture. Now, it's not to say that there are only 5, but these are the 5 major objections against the historical reliability of the Gospels. And I don't know what the alphabet, the Indonesian alphabet is, but the first 5 letters of the English alphabet is A, B, C, D, and E. Okay? Excellent. So, but your words might be a little different, so you'll have to see the English words here. So, to make it easy, this is like, so A stands for authorship. All right, the first objection is A, and authorship. And what the objection actually is some scholars will say is, we have no idea who the authors of the Gospels are. We don't know who wrote them. Why? They'll say because the Gospels, in their original manuscripts, were anonymous. In other words, in our Bibles today, at the top of the Gospel, the title is the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. They will say that in our earliest manuscripts, those titles were not there. And so we have no idea, they say, who wrote them. This is a pretty bad reason for rejecting the reliability of the Gospels. It is true that the original Gospels, the manuscripts, were anonymous, that the names of the authors, there was no titles, okay? Probably in the originals, there were no titles. But that was not unusual for ancient literature. So for example, I mentioned Plutarch's Lives. He wrote between the years 90 and 120. So, around the same time as the Gospel of John until about 30 years after, 25 to 30 years after the John was written. And what's interesting is that, now I did, 8 years of study of Plutarch's Lives and the Gospels in relation to them. Would you like to know how many times Plutarch's name appears in those 50 biographies that survive? 0. Never. Not in the titles, not anywhere through the body of that life, of any of those 50 lives. His name, the name Plutarch, appears nowhere. And yet, scholars do not question whether Plutarch wrote those. They're pretty certain he wrote those, and I'll show you why in a moment. But here's what Mark Edwards at Christ Church, Oxford wrote. It is sometimes wrongly said that Gospels are anonymous because the author is not named in the proem. A nodding acquaintance with Plato, Plutarch, Lucian, or Porphyry, just to name a few names at random, would have undeceived the victims of this error. In other words, what Edwards is saying is that it was pretty commonplace in antiquity for the author's name to appear nowhere in the document. That doesn't mean that we don't know who wrote that document because it's not there. You say, well, how do we know that Plutarch was the author? That's a real good question, Zach. So let me answer that for you. We have what's called the Lamprias Catalog. We're not even certain when it's dated, but most scholars would say somewhere between the 3rd and the 4th century. Now, Plutarch wrote at the beginning of the 2nd century. Who was Lamprias? He was claimed to have been Plutarch's grandson. But here's the thing, if Lamprias was actually his grandson, and the Lamprias catalog of Plutarch's writings was written in the 3rd or 4th century, we're talking 100 to 200 years later. Would a grandson, given the typical lifespan back then, would a grandson have been alive at that point? Probably not. So the Lamprias catalog is most likely falsely attributed to Plutarch's grandson, and we really have no idea who wrote it. But it's the Lamprias catalog that tells us that Plutarch wrote those biographies. And that is our major evidence that Plutarch wrote those lives. And scholars take that and say, well, it is our only source, and we don't know who wrote the Lamprias catalog, but it makes sense what was written here that Plutarch wrote these, and nobody else claims that they wrote them. It's only claimed that Plutarch wrote them. And so scholars are pretty unanimous that Plutarch wrote those 50 biographies attributed to him. Now, the evidence we have for the authorship of the Gospels is far superior to the evidence we have that Plutarch wrote those 50 lives. Now, I know the font is very small. I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned that you get the idea of what's going on here. The first person to mention the authorship of our Gospels is a guy named Papias. And he wrote around the year 120, maybe a little earlier, maybe just a little later. And he mentions the authorship of Mark and Matthew. Our next person is a guy named Marcion. He was actually a heretic, but he mentions the authorship of the Gospel of Luke around the year 145. Our next one is a guy named Justin. He was later martyred, so they call him Justin Martyr. He wrote around the year 150, and he mentions the authorship of Mark and Luke. Our next author is Irenaeus. He wrote around the year 170 to 180, and he is the very first person that we know of who mentions the Gospels being written by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And then we have the anti-Marcionite, in other words, he was writing against Marcion, the anti-Marcionite prologue to the Gospel of Luke around the year 175, and he mentions Gospels written by Luke and John. Theophilus of Antioch, around the year same time, 175, mentions the Gospel of John being written by John. Bullseye. Yeah. Then we have Tertullian, around the year 200, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Clement of Alexandria. You get the idea here. What's interesting is, of all of these, and then we have even more, they're all unanimous that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Nobody said Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Josephus. It's always Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Nobody else is listed as an author of the Gospels. It's unanimous. That's pretty amazing. It's not just one person, the Lamprias catalog, that attributes them to Plutarch. And we have no idea who Lamprias was. It's all these early church fathers who we know who they were, And they're attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John without exception. They're all in agreement. That's pretty strong. And then that's not to say that the early church fathers are all correct, that nobody could have gotten them wrong. It's God's word, the scriptures, that are divinely inspired, not the early church fathers. But I got to ask, as a historian, what's the chance that all of them got it wrong on every one of the authors? That would be a stretch of the imagination, to say that all of them got it wrong with every author. That's not good history. That's not being a good historian to claim that that's what happened. That they all got it wrong all of the time. It's more likely that at least they got it right pertaining to many of the Gospels, if not all of them. And even though the Gospel of Matthew is the one most in question who wrote it, it's interesting to note that the Gospel of Matthew is the most strongly attested by the early church fathers, and that the Gospel of Matthew was the favorite gospel of the early church. Why would that be the case if it was falsely attributed to Matthew? So it seems to me that we have initially some pretty good evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were, if they didn't author the Gospels, they were somehow involved in the writing of those Gospels, and in a major way. Now, there is something else I want to mention here. Bart Ehrman, is he a name here? Is anybody, does Bart Ehrman, do people know of him here in Indonesia as a skeptic? Yeah. His books, okay. So when I debated him 4 weeks ago, whatever it was, he said we have no idea who wrote the Gospels, you know? And I said, well, sure we do. And I presented some evidence. And he said, but these were all illiterate fishermen, Jesus' disciples. They could not have written a gospel. And so I pointed out and I said, they could have just had a scribe write it for them. It's no big deal. And he says, well, we don't have any evidence of that. I said, we don't need it. You've got Cicero, who's one of the most highly educated Romans in the late Roman Republic, in the middle of the 1st century BC. As educated as he was, and known as a great orator, there was an occasion in one of his letters, he had a secretary, a scribe, named Tiro. And he wrote to Tiro and he said, Auntie came over to my house for dinner, and he asked me to read something that I'd written. And he said, no, I can't do it because Tiro isn't here, and Tiro makes me sound so much better. So here you have one of the most highly educated Romans, and he used a scribe to help him craft letters and literature because he could do such a better job. So Cicero would give him the ideas, and Tiro would write it down and make it good. Now, for those of you who are really into studying the Bible and on a seminary type level, Paul wrote 13 letters that are attributed to him in the New Testament. Which is the crown jewel, the most pristine of all of Paul's letters? Romans. So Hotman says Romans, you're right. Did you know that in Romans chapter 16, verse 22, it says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, send you my greetings. Tertius, who's that? It's Paul's scribe. In several of Paul's letters, he ends it, I, Paul, who write this greeting, send you my, who write this greeting, send you my greetings. Okay? Well, that means he didn't write the rest of the letter. He had a scribe. But because Romans is so much better literature, higher quality literature than all these other letters, it shows that Tertius was involved in more than just taking dictation. He actually edited and made it sound a whole lot better, to make it read better. Now, if Cicero and Paul, who were two highly trained and educated, literate Romans, could use a scribe, and we could still say this was Paul's letter, this was Cicero's letter, then why is it that we couldn't say the Gospels, if their authors were illiterate, Why couldn't they have used the scribe? No problem at all.
We have here an example.
What's that?
Even the famous evangelist Stephen Tamu. There are many books refer to him, to Stephen, but actually he never wrote anything. All the assistant. Wow. Yeah.
They said a famous evangelist, he had many books attributed as the author, but actually one of his assistants helped write these, not he. There's a contemporary example here in Indonesia. All right, so for the traditional authorship of the Gospels, the early church tradition says that Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples. He was a tax collector. That Mark received his information directly from Peter, the lead apostle. That Luke received information from the eyewitnesses, and that John was one of Jesus' disciples. Now we saw in the previous lecture that the majority of scholars believe 2 and 3, or Mark and Luke, and they say that if John was not one of Jesus' disciples, that whoever the author was used one of Jesus' disciples as the primary source. I believe it was John, son of Zebedee, but most scholars don't. And that Matthew, we saw in the opening one that if he didn't author it, he must have been involved somehow in the composition of that gospel, even though we might not be certain to what extent that is. Still, that's pretty good. So that's A, authorship. Yes, sir? No, Mark and Luke were not they were not Jesus' disciples, not the 12, not the 70. At least the early church tradition doesn't think that. It doesn't say that they were. Was Mark, John Mark, who traveled with Paul? Many scholars say yes. Some say it's plausible or maybe probable, but not certain. But in any sense, they still think that the early church tradition is strong enough to suggest that Mark got his information directly from Peter. But he was not one of Jesus' disciples, not one of the 12 or 70, and there's nothing to suggest that Luke was either. So, good question. Okay, so you said that there are some church documents that say Mark and Luke were part of the 70. I've not heard that, so I can't comment on that. Yes, sir. Gospel of Judas. What about the Gospel of Judas? Well, Irenaeus does mention the Gospel of Judas. And he said it was a false gospel, that Judas had nothing to do with it, and that the Gospel of Judas was written by one of the Canaanites, not Canaanites, but Canaanites, which was a cult back then. And it said that, Irenaeus said that they would take villains, the Canaanites were known to take villains of the Bible and make them heroes. And when you read the Gospel of Judas, it does precisely that. It takes Judas, a villain of the Gospels, and makes him a hero. In which Jesus actually says, I want you to betray me, it's God's will. And Judas doesn't want to do it. And he says, Judas, you will be obeying God in it. So, now we didn't have any of the Gospel of Judas until maybe 10 years ago, or a little bit longer, that within the last 15 years. And it was discovered, and looking at it, and it matches exactly what Irenaeus said it would. So we know it existed prior to the year 180, but we know it's a false gospel. And as far as I know, there are no scholars, even skeptical scholars today, who think that Judas wrote it. Yes, sir.
someone to open the gospel that he would.
Yeah, okay, so the question is, if we have Cicero and Paul who do mention that they use the scribe, but the Gospels don't mention that they use the scribe, do I have any evidence that they use that? Well, Cicero does mention in that letter that he had Tiro who made him sound better and helped him, but he doesn't mention it in other letters. So it's because of that one letter that Cicero wrote that we know that Tiro helped in the others. For Paul, he only says in a couple of his letters, I, Paul, who write this with my own hand, send you my greeting. In other words, he's signing it with his own hand, but that tells us he didn't write the rest of it. And then in Romans 16:22, he says, I, Tertius, who wrote this. But in those other letters, even though he doesn't mention it, because he does mention it in the others, I write this greeting with my own hand. I don't think it's implausible in the least. Does it mean that he did not use it? Does it mean that he used the scribe in all of his letters? No. But it's certainly plausible that he did. Now, when it comes to the Gospels, if the Gospel authors were illiterate, what I'm saying is when Ehrman and some say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could not have written them because they were illiterate, my response is, it doesn't matter if they were illiterate, they could have used the scribe. And so the objection that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could not have been the authors of these Gospels doesn't work. They can't prove that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were illiterate, right? So I don't have to prove that they used the scribe. Why should I have to prove something when they can't prove their objection? Yeah.
But I think what we are discussing is not about certainty, but possibility.
Yeah.
But this possibility is enough to argue that even though they are illiterate, doesn't mean that it is not true, the gospel, right?
Right. Yeah. So we're talking plausibility here. So we can claim that most fishermen were illiterate, but we don't know that all of them were. We don't know that the gospel authors were. In fact, the Gospels talk about how James and John, the sons of Zebedee, when Jesus called them, they left their boats and followed Jesus. Well, what's interesting is it says that Zebedee, their father, they left their boats with the servants and they followed Jesus. Well, wait a minute, Zebedee had servants? They weren't poor. If you have servants, you're not poor. And if you're not poor, you might be illiterate. So we don't know that the disciples of Jesus were illiterate, or all of them. We don't know that Matthew and John were illiterate. And Mark and Luke, we don't know enough about them, so they could very well have been literate. Luke, if the church tradition is correct, was a physician, so of course he would have been literate. Mark, we don't really know much about. We don't know about his background. So he may have been, he may not have been. We know from the vocabulary that he used and his grammatical style that he did not have the education that Luke had. But of course he was literate. Whoever wrote it was literate. So I don't see any reason to think that, to say that Jesus' disciples were illiterate. If you want to say that, well, that might exclude Matthew and John. It doesn't exclude Mark and Luke. And Matthew was a tax collector, so he was probably fluent in both Aramaic and in Greek. And he could very well have been literate. Now, was he literate enough? I mean, Matthew is really good literature. It's one of the best of the Gospels. So, would he have been that literate as a tax collector? Don't know. But even if he wasn't, just as Paul and Cicero used the scribe, so could Matthew have. I see no reason why John couldn't.
Another thing.
Yes, sir.
Why must we emphasize on the name? In fact, Paul's gospel itself mentioned
yeah, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Peter, they're false. Yeah. In fact, that they knew in the early church that they were false gospels. All right, second, B is bias. The claim is that we should not trust the Gospels because their authors were biased in trying to persuade. So not only are they biased, but they're also propaganda. And to that, I think we can answer is, just because you're biased doesn't mean you're wrong. If we're going to say that, then we'd have to say that a Jewish historian could never write about the Holocaust. We'd have to say that in the United States, a black historian could not write on slavery in the United States. And of course we'd say, well, that's just crazy. A black historian may be the very best kind of historian to write on slavery in the US. A Jewish historian may be the very best kind of historian to write on the Holocaust. Why? Because they had family members that were part of slavery and Hitler's Holocaust. They would be driven to get the facts better and more accurate and dig deeper to find those facts than someone who hadn't been impacted by those things at all. Just because you're biased or you have an interest in it doesn't mean it's wrong. Now that doesn't mean that we should say, oh, well, if the person's biased, that's all good. But you know what? We're all biased. Every last one of us. The illustration I'll give you in the United States a few years ago in the Super Bowl, my home football team, American football team, the Baltimore Ravens, was in it, and they were expected to lose against the San Francisco 49ers. And the Ravens just got off to a great start, and they were crushing the 49ers in the first half, and they got off to a great second half, and all of a sudden the 49ers came back. And it came down to the last minute of the game, and then it came down to the last play. And the 49ers had the ball, and if they score a touchdown, they win. And the quarterback goes back and he throws the ball, and it goes in the end zone, and it just sails over the fingertips of the receiver, and the Ravens win. The 49ers coach, you can see it on the replay, the Ravens player, there was a little bit of contact in the end zone. And so if you're a 49ers fan, you're saying, come on, ref, that was pass interference. There should be a penalty on one more play. And if you're a Ravens fan, you're saying, nah, this is football, let them play. It just depends what team you're pulling for on whether it was should have been a penalty. We're all like that. If you have a son or a daughter and they're playing soccer and you're watching the game and they fall down, well, is that a foul or did they trip? Well, it depends if your son is the one who got tripped, isn't it? We're all biased because of our race, gender, ethics, nationality, our political, our religious, our philosophical convictions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attend, the very people whose acceptance and respect we desire. It causes biases in all of us. But we have to look at evidence, not the bias. Derek Ludeman is an atheist New Testament scholar. He wrote a book in 2004 saying The Resurrection of Christ. And in that book he refers to another book he wrote on the resurrection in the 1990s. And he says, the aim of that book was to prove the non-historicity of the resurrection of Jesus and simultaneously to encourage Christians to change their faith accordingly. Was Ludeman biased? Yes. Did he have an agenda? Yes. He wanted to convert people or deconvert them. And they would criticize the Gospel of John, who says, I am writing these things so that you may believe, and say that's propaganda. Well, he's coming right out and saying, I am writing these things so that you may not believe. What's that?
He was
Gertie. Wow. Okay. So did you have him for an advice? Interesting. But we wouldn't say that what Ludeman is writing is false because he was biased and had an agenda. We look at his arguments, and then we can see that his arguments are really lousy. And we'd say, okay, we don't believe it because his arguments are bad, not because he's biased. Richard Dawkins, you all know who he is, right? One of those militant atheists. He's not just a regular atheist, he's a militant atheist. He hates Christians. He hates the concept of God. And he says, he writes this book called The God Delusion. And he says, if this book works as I intend, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down. Is Dawkins biased? Does he have an agenda? Does that mean he's wrong? No. You have to look at his arguments. And then you even have Michael Roos, who is a philosopher of science at Florida State University, and he is an atheist, and he says that Dawkins' arguments in that book, The God Delusion, are so bad, it makes him embarrassed to be an atheist. So you look at the arguments, not the fact that he's biased. So if the gospel authors are biased, and they were, I mean, if you had been with Jesus and you saw him do these things and you saw him do miracles and rise from the dead, yeah, you'd be biased, but it doesn't mean you're wrong. Yeah, you want to tell people about Jesus, you'd like to see them become Christians, but that doesn't mean what you're proclaiming is false. Here's a big one, C, contradictions. How many of you have talked to a non-Christian and they said, we can't believe the Bible is because they contradict one another? Now, lots of them. That's probably the major one. It's probably the biggest objection against the reliability of the Gospels. Let me give you a few things to think about here. In fact, what Urban will say this. He's got this little thing that he does for rhetoric, and it's pretty powerful. He says, well, we want the Gospels to agree with one another if they're reliable, but let's see what they do. Let's just consider Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection in the Gospels. When we come to the crucifixion, did Jesus carry his cross all the way, as Matthew, Mark, and Luke say, or did or like John says, or did Simon of Cyrene help him, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke say? Well, it depends which Gospel you read. The Gospels say that Jesus was crucified between two thieves. The Gospel of Mark says that both thieves cursed Jesus, whereas the Gospel of Luke says that one repented and said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Which one is correct? Well, it depends which Gospel you read. Was Jesus crucified at 9 a.m. like Mark says, or was it just after 12 noon like John says? Well, it depends which Gospel you read. Was he crucified the day after they ate the Passover meal, or was he crucified the day of the Passover meal? Well, it depends which Gospel you read. Did the temple veil tear in half after Jesus died, like Matthew and Mark say, or is it before Jesus died, like Luke says? It depends which Gospel you read. When on Easter morning, and Jesus was raised from the dead, how many women went to the tomb? Was it multiple women, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke report? Or was it Mary Magdalene only, like John seems to suggest? It depends which one you read. And when they got there, how many angels did they see? One, like in Matthew and Mark? Or were there two, like Luke and John? It depends which gospel you read. Where did Jesus first appear to them? Was it in Galilee, like Mark suggests, and Matthew says? Or was it in Jerusalem, like Luke and John say? It depends which gospel you read. And how long did Jesus stay with them? Was it for a matter of weeks or days, like the Gospels say or imply, like Mark, Matthew, and John say or imply? Or did Jesus rise from the dead and appear to everybody and ascend on Easter like Luke portrays? Wow, it depends which gospel you read. And by the time he's done all this, all the Christians in the audience are saying, say it ain't so! Well, if you check your Bibles, all of those differences are correct. They're really there. So what do we do with those? Let's look at a few things. Number one, we'll look at the historical implications. The first thing is, what if? What if all of these are errors? What if there's all these errors in the Gospels? Let's just assume for a moment there are no explanations that all of them are errors. Can anybody tell me what this is? The Titanic. A little over 100 years ago, it goes down, it sinks, and more than half of its passengers die. That's really interesting. Of the survivors, some of them said that the Titanic went down in one piece. And others said, no, it broke in two before it sank. And when they're on, as eyewitnesses in court hearings for investigations, it say, nope, it went down to one piece. Other eyewitnesses, no, it broke in half, and then say, no, I was there, I saw it went down to one piece. No, I was there too, and it broke in half and went down. Well, how do you reconcile those two? You can't. But nobody turned around and said, well, I guess the Titanic didn't sink. They just said, well, one of them got it wrong, and it doesn't matter anyway because it's one of the small details. The overall story is still true. It's just someone got one of the minor details wrong. You know, all these details that Bart Ehrman and others will talk about are all minor details. Was there one or two angels? Well, it doesn't mean the tomb wasn't empty. Did Jesus die? Was he crucified at 9 a.m. or just after noon? Nobody's disputing that he was crucified. Was it the day after the Passover meal or the day of the Passover meal? No one's disputing that he was crucified around the time of the Passover. You see what I mean? It's like, these are minor things. It happens in history all the time. I've been studying Roman history and Plutarch and all these. When you come to the assassination of Caesar, Julius Caesar, you look at what Appian, Cicero, Dio, Livy, Nicolaus, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Velleius, how they all report what happened in Caesar's assassination. You wouldn't believe the differences in their accounts, discrepancies. Far more than what we find in the Gospels. And yet no one turns around and says, well, Caesar, I guess, wasn't assassinated. They don't even deny the details. It's just a matter of certain details. And a lot of the differences are easily explained by what are called compositional devices, which is all what I'm going to be discussing tomorrow and Saturday in the seminar. We'll be getting into this in a lot of depth over the next 2 days. We're just going to concentrate on that. One of the things we have, so number one, we say, is it a big deal if there are, even if there were errors and discrepancies, if all of these couldn't be resolved? Well, it doesn't mean that Jesus didn't die. It doesn't mean that he didn't rise from the dead. It just means that there are, at the very worst, there are discrepancies in the minor details. It doesn't mean that the events didn't occur. You might say, well, the Bible's not inerrant, if that were the case, but it doesn't mean that it's not reliable. So that's a worst case scenario. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying even if, it's not that bad. Second, we have to distinguish between a contradiction and a difference. Now back where I'm at. It's not moving. No. So we talk about, you got some saying the Titanic broke in half before sinking and some said it didn't. That's a contradiction. That cannot be reconciled. Someone got it wrong. And when the Titanic was discovered, we found that the people who got it right were those who said the Titanic broke in half before it sank. We say, how many women went to the tomb? Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke say there were multiple women. The Gospel of John only reports one. It said, early in the morning while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene got up and went to the tomb and found it empty. So was it just Mary Magdalene or were there multiple women? Here's something that's really interesting. We'll get more into this weekend. John does not say only Mary. He only mentions Mary. Maybe there were other women. Say, well, you could say maybe, but it just mentions Mary. Not so fast. When we read the next verse, remember it says, early in the morning while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene got up and went to the tomb and found it empty. Verse 2, she ran back to Peter and the beloved disciple and said, they have taken the Lord, and what's the next word? We don't know where they laid him. Who's we? Isn't that interesting? Then you come to what happens next. Who runs to the tomb? Well, according to John, it says, Peter and the beloved disciple got up and ran to the tomb and found it, just as Mary had said. But when you read it in Luke, it said Peter got up and ran to the tomb and found it, as the women had said. Well, was it just Peter, or was it Peter and the beloved disciple? Well, Luke does not say just Peter. Well, wait a minute, Mike. He only mentions Peter. Not so fast. Because 12 verses later, Jesus is talking to the Emmaus disciples. They're walking along, and Jesus said, "Oh, fellas, why do you seem so sad?" And they say, and it said, their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So Jesus is playing with them now. He says, "I'm going to have some fun with these guys. Why do you look so sad, guys? Are you the only one in Jerusalem, pal, who doesn't know what's going on the last couple of days?" And Jesus says, "No, what? That must have been fun." "What? Oh, tell me what happened." "Well, there was this guy, Jesus, who thought he was the Messiah, a prophet, and our leaders got a hold of him, and they turned him over to the Romans, and they crucified him, and oh. Then some of our women went to the tomb this morning. We saw some angels who said he'd been raised from the dead. He came back and told us. And then some of our own went to the tomb and found it as the women had said. Some of our own. It's plural. Isn't that interesting? So why does he just mention Peter? Because Peter was the main one. Why does John just mention Mary Magdalene? Because she was the main one. That is a literary technique called spotlighting. It's like you go to a theatrical performance and there are multiple people on stage, and then all of a sudden the lights go down and a spotlight shines on a person who begins to sing. You know others are present on the stage, but you don't see them because the spotlight is shining on that person. What John and Luke have done here is they've shown their literary spotlight on Mary Magdalene and on Peter. In my studies of Plutarch and ancient biographies, this is one of the very major compositional devices they use, probably more than anything else. It is very common. And we see that's what the gospel authors are using. So is it a contradiction or a difference? It's a difference. And then, as we're going to be talking about Friday and Saturday, it's the genre of the Gospels. As I mentioned in the opening lecture, they're ancient biographies. Now, how many of you are married? I don't know what it's like here in Indonesia, but I would guess it's pretty close to how it is back in North America. If anybody's married, you know what I mean when I say there's the guy version of the story and the girl version of the story. Now, back in North America, women like details, and lots of them. They want to know what happened, where it happened, when it happened, why it happened, how it happened, who was there, what they were wearing, what they were saying, what they were thinking, what they were feeling. And now that you know about this, how do you feel about it? Now, guys are different. We like bullet points. Get to the bottom line. We don't care about all these other details that aren't significant. We will feel free to leave out details, to even change some minor, to get to the point of the story and to make that point as clearly as possible. Now, I don't know if any of you men have experienced this, but there have been multiple times I've been on the phone, I'll be talking to a friend, I'll be telling them about a story about what happened, and my wife's in the background and she says, "You know it didn't happen that way." So, ancient authors would report things sometimes like the girl version, sometimes like the guy version. The guys, men aren't trying to deceive when we change things a little bit or abbreviate the story. We're trying to get the major points and to communicate them in a clear manner. Ancient biography a lot of times gave us the guy version of the story. Let me give you an example of the difference in how this manifests itself in the Gospels. How many of you are aware of Jesus cursing the fig tree and what happened? You guys don't read your Bibles here? So we find Mark. Mark gives us the girl version of the story. It says they got up one morning early and they were in Bethany and they got up and they went to Jerusalem. And on their way to Jerusalem, they saw a fig tree and Jesus wanted some figs off of it, and there weren't any, because it wasn't the season, and so he cursed it. Now they went into Jerusalem that day, and that's the day he overturned the tables in the temple, and at the end of the day they left the temple, and they came back and went back to Bethany, and they spent the night there. The next morning they got up and they had breakfast, and they had pancakes with Mrs. Butterworth's syrup, and Peter had the regular stuff, Jesus had Mrs. Butterworth's light syrup. Peter had coffee, Jesus said, I'll have decaf. Peter had eggs and sausage. No, they were Jews, they didn't have pork. And so they had all this breakfast, and then after breakfast they left Bethany, and they went to Jerusalem, and Peter said, Lord, the tree that you cursed yesterday has withered and died. That's Mark. Now Matthew gives us the guy version, the man version of the story. He doesn't care about all these details. So he says they went to Jerusalem, Jesus cursed the tree, and it died. That's it. Now, I suppose Mark and Matthew are talking later, and Mark says, but Maddie, you know it didn't happen that way. They went into Jerusalem, and at the end of the day, they went back. And the next morning, they got up, and they went back to Jerusalem, and that's when they saw it. It didn't just die on the spot. And Matthew says to him, Mark, you remind me of my wife. That's all we're going to be focusing on really on Friday and Saturday. D, dating. Now this isn't like dating leading to marriage. This is the dating of the Gospels. When are they dated? I just saw a cartoon this last week. This guy says to his daughter, they're sitting down at dinner, and he says, so, are you dating Mark these days? And she said, she's a theological student. She says, yeah, I put it around here 55 to 60. What some scholars will say is that the Gospels, as we know, most scholars agree that the Gospels were written somewhere between 35 and 65 years after Jesus' death. Now, there are various datings, and some scholars will will date the Gospels earlier. And not only just conservative scholars, you have Morris Casey and his doctoral student James Crossley, both agnostics. And they put Mark in the 40s. That's odd. Most scholars these days put Mark sometime in the 50s or the 60s. Some place it afterward. But we just want to give an average date of maybe 65 to 70. A lot of them earlier, but maybe 65 to 70 is the majority. And then you've got Matthew a little after that. I know there's arguments that put Matthew and Luke prior to the 60s, and they may be right. I'm just saying where most scholars are today, and you're looking at, John probably between the year 90 and 95 or 60 to 65 years after Jesus. Yes, I think there's a decent argument to place John before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70. But we don't know. I'm just saying where the majority of scholars are today, they place it between 35 and 65 years after Jesus. Now some scholars will say, 35 to 65 years, that's so long. Their memory would be corrupted, we can't trust it because it's so long. It's brilliance. What about Alexander the Great? He dies in the year 323 BC. Our two major sources, our two best sources for Alexander the Great is Arian of Nicomedia, who wrote around the year 100, or about 400 years after Alexander. And our other best source is Plutarch, who wrote, why do I got 145 there? No, that's wrong. He wrote about maybe around the year 120. Well, that's still about 400 years after Alexander. Both of them are writing about 400 years after Alexander, and those are our two best sources to know about Alexander the Great. 35 to 65 years is looking pretty good. Plutarch, when he's writing about Julius Caesar and people like that, you're looking at about 140 years later. 35 to 65 years is pretty good. Let me say something else. Back in the U.S., we still have survivors, people who fought in World War II. I mentioned that guy who could still smell those native women 70 years later. All right? We get documentaries that still come out on World War II with eyewitnesses. If we're going to say 35 to 65 years is too long, then we'd say don't interview those guys anymore, even though they were eyewitnesses. They could never remember. Even Vietnam was like 40 years ago. That's on the outside of when Mark was written, and yet we've got lots of Vietnam veterans. And they still do documentaries. They just released one recently by Ken Burns about 2 months ago, or it was I think last September in the United States. They released the most recent documentary on Vietnam. Well, Vietnam was over in 1975 when the Americans finally got out, so it was at 25, 35, 43, 42 years later. We still have Vietnam vets who were there, and they're 42 years later. That's longer than after Mark was written. Are we going to say we shouldn't trust these guys anymore? It's too long? Of course not. You remember those things. Stuff like being in battle. You might get some of the minor details confused, but you still remember the gist of what happened big time. Finally, eyewitnesses. Eyewitness. What some of the skeptics will say is, well, the Gospels aren't based on eyewitness testimony. And they'll say more like, what we have here is like the game of telephone, or like they say in parts of the world, Chinese whispers. What you played in kindergarten, where the teacher whispers something in your ear, and they whisper something to the next student, By the time you get to the end of the classroom, it's something totally different. Well, some skeptical scholars, or like the form critics, they would say, well, you know, you got the stories passed along, and after 40 years, 35 years, the form that story had taken by that end is what got included in the Gospels. Now, the problem with that is that it doesn't take into account the continuing role of the eyewitnesses. As I was saying as we were eating, it's as though right after Jesus' death, his disciples disappeared on a permanent religious retreat, never to be seen from again. Paul's undisputed letters in the book of Acts discredit such a view, because it talks about how Jesus' disciples, the eyewitnesses, were out for another more than 3 decades proclaiming Jesus' teachings, his miracles, and his resurrection. And that takes us up to the very doorstep of when the first Gospel, Mark, was written. Moreover, remember I mentioned in the other one, it's not like they'd only seen or heard Jesus once. They heard him teach the same things just countless times, and then they taught it countless times. Moreover, I also said here at dinner that a few years ago I was speaking at a conference, and I talked about the, over and over and over, and a kindergarten teacher came up to me after and said, hey, you know how you talked about the game of telephone, Chinese whispers? Well, I do that with my students every year. And after they get it wrong and they laugh and giggle, then I tell them, I said, now this time we're going to do it again. I'm going to give you a new sentence, and you better get it perfect, or there's no recess, no playtime today. And they always get it perfect. Even 5-year-olds can get it right when they want to. This message of Jesus' teachings was something that was life. It was eternal life to the earliest Christians. They took it very seriously. How many of you are martial artists when you practice the martial arts in here? Anybody? A few of you? Martial arts? I used to. What's that?
Ikut bela diri apa? Oh, body combat. Wow. Ada yang lainnya ikut bela diri di sini? Taekwondo.
Practice into martial arts. I got a 2nd degree black belt in Taekwondo, and I was an instructor. I had my own school for 3 years. So anyone who's trained in those kind of traditional martial arts know that you learn forms. sequences and moves where you block, punch, kick, do it in all the different directions. Well, you're not allowed to change that stuff. You have to do what you're instructed, and that person, like I learned from my instructor who learned directly from the founder of Taekwondo, General Cheyani. So my instructor could say, Mike, I gave to you what I also received from the founder. And this is what Paul says, I delivered to you what I also received from the Jerusalem apostles. So it's the stuff that you pass along, and it's put in a formal form so that it makes it easier to memorize. So you don't have this flexibility to just change and invent things. It has to maintain the gist. So I mentioned again, telephone. All right, so just wrapping this up, we have discussed the ABCs, D's, and E's, the authorship, bias, contradictions, dating, and eyewitnesses. These are the 5 major objections to the historical reliability of the Gospels. And I've just provided for you how to answer those things. So, why don't we, can we open it up for questions now?
Right. Now we come to the second discussion. If you have any questions that you want to ask to Professor Licona, you may raise your hands first. And you are welcome to disagree with him. Okay, any question? One from you, and the second one is Amadeo. Another one, we can have the first 3 questions. Any other? No, just 2. Okay, then we will all the last one. Okay, you can use the microphone. It is already prepared.
My name is Ph.D. First of all, I want to say I have no technology. My background is anthropology, so I want to say, do you think personal experience can be biased? And how about last 2012, I went to Israel, and how do you think about historical places based on the Bible? I just found out that Catholics have their own version, also Christians have their own version. What do you think about it?
I was in Israel this past October. It was my first time there. And so I saw those sites. I was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they have the Catholic and the Greek Orthodox site of Jesus' crucifixion. But I mean, we're right next to each other. And when I mean right next to each other, as you know, it's in the same building. And it's not like it's like here versus 2 rooms over. It's like I could do this and touch the person over there who says it's the Catholic line, So is it this rock here, or is it this rock here? Does that matter? And then there is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they have a site that they think might have been the tomb of Jesus, and then there's the garden tomb, right? As far as I know, almost all scholars, not all, but almost all think that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre probably has the greatest claim to being the actual one, not the garden tomb. So my colleague at Houston Baptist University, Craig Evans, I think he was here a few years back. Now he does archaeology, and he studies this a whole lot more, and he's written books on archaeology and Jesus. And he says, basically, at the end of the day, we can't be certain about any of these sites. We know that Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. Do we know the precise spot? Maybe, maybe not. Or maybe these traditional sites, they may be, some have a greater probability than others, but at the end of the day, we can't know for certain regarding most of them. Does that make sense? go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they think that that is it. And you go to the Garden Tomb, the tour guide will say, no, this is it. So I'm really not so much concerned with the locals think. I want to know what the archaeologists think. And they will say, well, some things are more probable than others, but we can't know for sure.
I want to share my dissertation project. When I did my dissertation project on the Gospel of Mark, as a believing in the Gospel of Mark, I bumped into the place called Dalmanuta. You know the Dalmanuta, right? The method actually is not Dalmanuta, but the other name. But then I received an article from Professor Kendall from Birmingham University. He sent me an article that he found, he said some archaeologists have found a place that was called Dalmanuta in the Gospel of Mark. Jadi, ya, saya mau share sebagian. Waktu saya menulis disertasi saya di Jerman, di Göttingen, saya terpaku pada satu tempat dalam Injil Markus. Kalau saya tidak salah pasal 8, itu ada tempat namanya Dalmanuta. Dan kalau membaca kritikus aparatus dalam Injil Markus, maka Dalmanuta itu punya versi yang lain-lain. Dan di Matius tidak disebut Dalmanuta, disebut Magada, Magdala, dan yang lain-lain. Dan kemudian 2013 saya dikirimi artikel oleh Profesor Kendall, dia seorang arkeolog bukan teolog dari Birmingham University atau Nottingham, saya lupa, dan dikatakan telah terjadi cukup banyak penemuan yang kemudian menunjukkan Dalmanuta itu sekarang persisnya di mana. Jadi memang seharusnya kita bukan bergantung pada tulis guides itu, tapi bagaimana arkeolog kemudian merekonstruksi ulang, menemukan tempat-tempat yang sudah hilang di dalam Alkitab itu yang dalam konteks modern sudah hilang. Saya ingin share saja. Terima kasih. Sekarang kita masuk ke pertanyaan yang kedua. Amadeo boleh masuk ke depan.
Thank you, Professor Licona, for your remarkable presentation and for encouraging us to come back to think about the historicity of the Gospels. Professor Licona, my name is Amadeo David Udako, and I am currently doing my undergraduate studies. I'm in the third year of my studies. So, Professor, I have a few questions. In the first session, you elaborated that the Gospel of Mark touched on the issue of the divinity of Jesus. And how would you respond to objections? Objections based on a more maybe this is liberal theologians that suggest that the Gospel of Mark needs to be interpreted not as a spiritual gospel, but as a social gospel. For example, there is a story of the Jared city who's been possessed by demons in the Gospel of Mark. And there is this interpretation that suggests that it is not a historical event. And this interpretation suggests that this event is symbolic. And the message of this story, the message of this the passage that tells about the story is that Jesus cares about the poor and the hungry, so that these scholars tend to think of this story as symbolic or historical. How would you respond to that? And the second question is, how would you take the Bulgarian approach to the Gospels? As we have already known, and I think most of us here are educated in Bulgarian as well. Dr. Bulgarian, in the purpose of this method is not to eliminate, but to reinterpret the mythology of the Bible or the Gospel. And my question is, how would you make what Rudolf said that faith shouldn't have been primarily concerned with history? And this was also resounded by Richard Higgs, New Testament scholar, who said that no matter how fascinating and how sophisticated the historical criticism methods are constructed and formed, they are speculations. And Richard Higgs agrees with Elizabeth Kuliah, who offers a more contemporary view of reading, which is the rigorous concept.
Yeah, a lot of what you're saying, unless I start answering.
All right. So that's my question.
So in terms of Richard Hayes, he was my external reader for my doctoral dissertation, and he approved it without any suggested changes, and he without any criticisms, and he approved it with distinction. And so he is not at all against historical method to looking at Jesus in that way. In terms of Rudolf Bultmann, scholars, a lot of them have gone beyond him now. He had a bias against the supernatural. He even made a famous statement that in the day of electric lights and toasters, it is not reasonable to believe in miracles. Well, as Craig Keener probably shared with you all, we have really good reason to believe in miracles because they continue to happen even to this very day. I'm sure a number of you could mention miracles that you've either witnessed or people who you know who have witnessed them. So people being healed, Craig even knows people who have been raised from the dead. So we do know miracles that are happening today. I think for people like Bultmann to say that it's irrational for us to believe it just shows that he should have spent less time in his office and more time talking to people. Because when you start to talk to people in the real world outside of your academic office, you find that miracles happen. That doesn't mean that every miracle report is true, but a lot of them are true. When we come to the Gospels, the social scientific method that attempts to explain away all miracles in terms of metaphors or deeper meaning, you have the deeper meaning because the event itself occurred. If the event did not occur, it really doesn't have much meaning unless we're talking in parable. And a lot of these stories about the miracles of Jesus, like the Gadarene demoniac legion, who was cast out into the swine that went down into the Sea of Galilee, I don't see that this is in any sense to be viewed as a parable. And there are a lot of Jesus' miracles, even some of his nature miracles, that are multiply attested, such as Jesus walking on water, Jesus feeding the 5,000, or the multiplication of fishes in Luke and John. These are multiply attested, and that is the strongest form out there to verify. I mean, even skeptical scholars, even like Bart Ehrman, would say multiple independent sources is the best way to verify the authenticity of an event. And that's what we have for many of these things. Now, some scholars today will say, well, criteria like multiple independent sources, criterion of embarrassment, or unsympathetic sources, that we are leaving those today. Some scholars are, the majority are not. But even those that are leaving it, people like Dale Allison at Princeton, for whom I have the highest respect, even though I don't agree with him on this thing about the criteria, Allison will even say that he may not go with multiple independent sources or the criterion of embarrassment, but what he does say is we look for a general motif. So we might not be able to verify any, according to Dale Allison, we might not be able to verify a particular miracle account that Jesus cast out a demon on this occasion, but because there are so many stories, he says we can't deny that Jesus was an exorcist. And he says the same thing about miracles. We may not be able to verify that Jesus walked on water or fed the 5,000, but we can verify because of all the stories, it's a motif that Jesus was known as a miracle worker in his day. Now I would go beyond that and say, yes, motif is right, but multiple independent sources, embarrassing sources, if an unsympathetic source like Josephus or Tacitus mentions it, we have good reasons to believe it if they're saying something Jesus did that verifies what's in the Gospels. So I just wouldn't go with the Boltonian view, and like I said, most scholars, even skeptical ones, have gone beyond that. He believed in the form criticism, like the game of telephone, which not too many scholars, they will take form criticism, but in a very modified form from what Boltmann and Debellis believe. But good questions.
Baik, berhubung saya juga belajar di bidang perjanjian baru, saya ingin ada dua komen yang saya mau tambahkan. Pertama, Boltmann itu sudah ketinggalan zaman sebetulnya. Sudah dalam studi biblika, eksegesis biblika, kita sudah bergerak jauh dari sana. Sudah jauh dari sana. Bahkan dia ada sebelum saya lahir. Gitu ya. Yang kedua terkait Boltmann, karena tadi Amadeo bertanya tentang sebetulnya postkolonial. Itu adalah dua cara pembacaan teks yang tidak perlu harus dipertentangkan. Yang pertama adalah historical, yang kedua adalah postkolonial. Tapi teks yang sama bisa dibaca dengan dua cara tadi, historical dan postkolonial. Artinya saya melihat itu sebagai historis, tapi saya juga bisa kemudian menafsirnya dari perspektif postkolonial, bahwa kata legion itu yang dimaksud Romawi, dan Romawi adalah penjajah, dan Yesus berarti saat itu sedang hendak mendobrak penjajahan kolonial Romawi atas bangsa Palestina. Dua-duanya bisa berjalan bersama-sama. Tafsir postkolonial tidak menegasikan tafsir historis. Ini yang harus dipahami dulu dalam perspektif tafsir, karena saya mengajar juga tafsir. Itu yang pertama yang saya mau sampaikan. Terus kemudian terkait dengan roh jahat yang di Gerasa, saya pernah juga menyampaikan dalam beberapa perkuliahan saya. Sulit membayangkan bahwa itu hanya dongeng. Kenapa? Karena sampai zaman sekarang perdukunan juga banyak praktek eksorsis. Mengapa saya sampaikan perdukunan? Karena saya pernah membaca waktu saya mengerjakan disertasi saya, ada cukup banyak literatur yang ditulis oleh non-Christians tapi oleh Jewish people yang mengatakan bahwa Yesus memang melakukan mukjizat, tetapi mereka tidak percaya Yesus sebagai Mesias. Mereka percaya Yesus adalah dukun. I have a book in my office that is written that Jesus is a magician. So he did all the miracles as a magician, or which saya punya buku juga di ruangan saya menjelaskan bahwa Yesus memang mengerjakan itu semua, tapi karena dia adalah seorang dukun. Artinya walaupun kita tidak percaya asumsi teologis, konklusi teologisnya dia seorang dukun, tapi buku itu dan tulisan-tulisan rabi yang ditulis di abad ke-2 sampai abad ke-4 justru membenarkan bahwa Yesus melakukan mukjizat-mukjizat, dan mereka adalah external eyewitnesses. Mereka adalah saksi-saksi mata di luar kekristenan. Sehingga kalau saksi mata di luar kekristenan berkata Yesus memang melakukan mukjizat, tapi sebagai dukun, berarti Yesus memang melakukan mukjizat. Dan saksi-saksi itu tidak bisa diabaikan sama sekali, baik secara historis maupun secara teologis. Ini tanggapan saya kepada Amadeo. Now we come to the last question maybe because it is already 10 minutes before 8.
Ini sebenarnya bukan pertanyaan, jadi saya bahas Indonesia saja.
Pak, pakai mic Pak.
Kurang jelas, suara saya lebih jelas.
Oke Pak.
Soalnya jauh saya dengar.
Maklum orang Batak.
Jadi saya tidak mau kalimat saya miss dari teman-teman. Jadi Bapak manusia. Ini sharing. Melihat beliau ini, dari tadi saya ingat 2A. Satu dia, satu Pak Derman. Dan persis 2 minggu lalu sesudah dia debat, saya melototin ceramahnya. Dan apa yang diceritakan hari ini, dengar aja lagi YouTube persis, yaitu 6 kriteria menyatakan historical, lalu kesimpulannya the gospel is reliable. Lalu kemudian sergap sama si Herman, dia berkata tidak ada yang bisa dipercaya. Nah, dua-duanya kan ahli nih. Dia juga baca, dia juga research, Herman juga baca, Herman juga research. Bahkan menurut Herman dia punya situs yang harus bayar kalau masuk ke situ, ke blognya dia. Kalau dia akan gratis kan saya tuliskan ya. Nah, pertanyaan saya dari itu siangnya, kok bisa dua sama-sama belajar tapi berbeda? Kalau kita lihat tadi dua hal yang dikatakan dari menulis ke sumbernya, kalau dibandingkan dengan misalnya biografi Plutarch tadi kalau salah 900 tahun sampai 1000 tahun, ada Great Alexandria sekitar 400 tahun. Tapi orang percaya di sini. Kalau kita lihat Yesus hanya 35 tahun ya, 35 tahun kok orang nggak percaya. Itu satu dari sumber. Yang kedua, memori yang tadi dia bilang 70 tahun rasanya masih ingat. Nah, kalau kita bicara memori, Alkitab kan ditulis setelah Tuhan Yesus. Ya mungkin kalau Markus 65 berarti sekitar 30-35 tahun. Kalau Yohanes 96 berarti sekitar 60 tahun. Berarti masih lebih kecil dari 70 tahun. Berarti memorinya sebenarnya masih sangat kuat. Ya. Berarti sebenarnya nggak ada masalah tentang reliability daripada Alkitab. Betul ya? Kalau dibandingkan yang tadi Plutarch dan sebagainya. And now my question is,
ada pertanyaan juga rupanya.
How what will be your suggestion or advice to us the students that we in our search of the knowledge to become the scholar? We all go to the not in permanent way tradition, but in a mind tradition.
Thank you, my esteemed Manaf. For those here who are aspiring scholars and you want to learn the right things, then I would say either come to this seminary or Monopolis. Or you can read my books, or I mean, there are plenty of us out there, Craig Evans and Kinger and Blomberg and Dan Wallace, and myself and others who are Darren Bach, another great scholar, Ben Witherington, Tom Wright, Richard Balcom, plenty of them. In fact, I would say today, this may not have been the case 20 or 30 years ago, but I think today the best scholars are conservative scholars. That's not to say that there are no non-conservatives, like Dale Allison is not a conservative Christian scholar. He's one of the very finest in the world, I think. But the more skeptical non-Christian scholars, the thing is, they stopped reading what scholars who disagree with them said. So it's like Bart Ehrman does not read what more conservative scholars are saying. But conservative scholars read all of them. I read not only what conservative scholars say, I read what Bart Ehrman and skeptical scholars say. We, at Houston Baptist University, we give a very broad, they have to read very broadly. We think that conservative scholarship today, I'm speaking in broad terms, you know, it's not to say every scholar is this way, but broadly, generally speaking, I think evangelical or conservative scholarship today has stepped up to the plate. Well, you wouldn't say that here. They've stepped up their game. Would you say that here? No. They have become better scholars. They work a lot harder now than they did And the quality of conservative scholarship is far superior now than it was, say, 30 years ago. That's not to say that there wasn't good scholarship 30 years ago. You walk in your meals, you know, things like that, CFD mold, and people like that. But there's far better and more conservative scholarship now, whereas the more liberal scholarship, there's still really good liberal scholarship over there, but it's far fewer now. And conservative scholarship, the quality is a lot more now. So, does that answer your question, Tamu?
Sebelum kita tiba pada penutupan, saya ingin menambahkan satu saja. Tadi saya diskusi dengan beliau, saya menyampaikan satu pokok. Saya menyebut beliau tadi menyebut Joachim Yeremias. Joachim Yeremias adalah profesor perjanjian baru dari Göttingen, dari kampus saya. Dan dia pernah menulis tentang ipsissima vox Jesu. Ipsissima vox Jesu. Ipsissima vox Jesu dalam bahasa Latin adalah kata-kata yang betul-betul diucapkan oleh Yesus. Dan salah satu ipsissima vox Jesu adalah Amen Worte dalam bahasa Jermannya, atau Amen words, yang dalam bahasa Latin itu amen amen lego humin. Amin amin aku berkata kepadamu, yang dalam bahasa Indonesia diterjemahkan sesungguhnya aku berkata kepadamu. Dan dalam bahasa Inggris biasanya diterjemahkan truly I am saying to you. Dan dalam bahasa Yunani sebetulnya bukan truly tapi amen. Amen amen. Amen amen lego humin. Dan ibu bapak ketahui bahwa hanya Yesus satu tokoh yang menyebut amen di depan kalimat. Semua nabi dan para rasul lainnya menyebut amin di belakang kalimat. Dan bagi German scholars atau German scholarship, maka amen worte atau amen amen lego humin di depan kalimat itu menjadi salah satu tanda historisitas dari perkataan-perkataan Yesus. Dan ini sebetulnya sudah sejak 100 tahun yang lalu dikemukakan, karena beliau menulis tahun 1906, kira-kira begitu. Ini untuk menambahkan, tadi saya diskusi dengan beliau dan saya tanya apakah beliau aware dengan hal itu, dan dia katakan ya, tapi tadi tidak disebutkan. Ini menambah pengetahuan kita saja. Dan kita sudah mendapatkan cukup banyak masukan tentang bagaimana kita memahami Alkitab kita, baik perjanjian lama, perjanjian baru, tapi khususnya perjanjian baru dan lebih khusus lagi Synoptic Gospels, Injil-Injil Sinoptik. Dan kalau ibu bapak masih ingin mendalaminya, akan ada seminar esok hari Jumat di Emporium, di Mall Emporium, lantai berapa Pak? Lantai 5, dari Jumat pagi jam 9, 10 sampai sore beberapa sesi, dan juga Sabtu dari jam 9 sampai sore. Hari Sabtunya 2 sesi pertama saya juga akan memoderasi, jadi kalau bapak yang mau ke sana akan bertemu lagi dengan saya di sana. Saya pikir itu saja. Terima kasih untuk kehadiran teman-teman sekalian. Setelahnya jangan lupa silakan ambil sertifikat kehadiran, isi nama sendiri sesuai absen, dan saya rasa kita akan tiba pada closing ceremony. Saya kembalikan kepada Bapak Erik dan kita
terima kasih, Pak Asigor. I would like to invite Reverend Mulyadi, Dean of Public Relations of Jakarta Theological Seminary, to deliver a certificate and a token of appreciation to Professor Michael M. Licona, and also for the moderator, Reverend Asigor Sitanggang.
Ada mahasiswa yang foto kami, masukkan di YouTube ya, di Facebook.
And also for my moderator for tonight, Reverend Asigor Sitanggang.
Kami seperti tangga ya.
Ibu bapak sekalian, kami mengucapkan terima kasih untuk kehadiran kita pada kuliah umum tamu pada malam hari ini. Lalu sebagai informasi, kami mengundang ibu bapak sekalian juga untuk hadir dalam kuliah umum bulanan Kalam dan Kalam pada hari Senin 19 Maret 2016 dengan topik yang pertama, hospitalitas kekristenan awal oleh Sali Naomi Parasi, dan relasi diakonia dan teologi politik gereja oleh Topik Sarpapahan di Aula ini. Dan doa penutup akan disampaikan oleh Tamu. Baik, saya akan dengan doa dan nanti dimohon mengambil sertifikat di belakang. Kita doa. Kami kembali mengucap syukur kepada-Mu ya Tuhan untuk segala kesempatan yang Tuhan berikan kepada kami pada malam hari ini. Terima kasih untuk penyertaan Tuhan dalam kuliah umum yang telah kami lakukan bersama di tempat ini. Berkati dan sertailah Profesor Licona dalam pekerjaan dan pelayanannya, dan sertailah juga kami yang hadir di tempat ini ketika kami akan pulang ke tempat kami masing-masing, agar kami tiba dalam keadaan sejahtera. Kiranya hikmat Tuhan dan berkat Tuhan selalu mengiringi langkah perjalanan hidup kami. Bersyukur ini kami naikkan kepada-Mu hanya di dalam nama Yesus Kristus, Tuhan dan Juru Selamat kami. Amin.